A question that doesn't shout, but merely whispers, creeping into the deepest recesses of the mind long after the day's clamor has faded, stirs the thoughts of many. What if Jesus of Nazareth, the figure behind one of the world's greatest religions, left behind not only teachings but also descendants? This idea, like ancient dust in a forgotten chapel, slowly settles, not provoking immediate outrage, but rather a quiet, persistent challenge. The question of a surviving bloodline, so deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, is central. It's not a loud call to rebellion, but rather a subtle whisper that penetrates the mind and lingers long after the day's bustle subsides. What if Jesus of Nazareth, the very man whose life and teachings formed the basis of a myth, not only imparted his covenants to the world, but also fathered children? This hypothesis, unconventional for traditional understanding, settles in thought like weightless dust in an ancient chapel, not causing overt blasphemy, but generating a subtle yet powerful challenge. After all, as is well known, history is written by the victors, those who possess the power and opportunity to shape the narrative. But what happens to the stories of those who, for certain reasons, prefer to remain in the shadows, guarding their secrets in silence? Many authoritative scholars holding orthodox views will undoubtedly point to a complete lack of direct evidence. They will remind us of strict doctrines, immutable dogmas, and the decisions of church councils that over centuries determined which sacred texts deserved a place in the canon and which should be left buried in the sands of history, much like the famous Nag Hammadi manuscripts. Nevertheless, there is another group of researchers, the so-called marginal historians, or as they are sometimes called, the irreverent whisperers in the echo chambers of academia. It is they who have long meticulously traced a thin, speculative thread leading to the assumption, what if Mary Magdalene was not merely a faithful disciple, but also the mother of a secret bloodline, a genealogical tree that was not severed at Golgotha, but, on the contrary, quietly and strategically continued, reliably protected by the veil of time and shrouded in secrecy. Imagine a picturesque scene, a small boat gently rocking on the calm waves off the coast of ancient Gaul. In it, Mary Magdalene, burdened by unbearable grief, perhaps already pregnant, seeks salvation and refuge from the chaos and persecution rampant in Jerusalem after the tragic events. The air around her is filled with the salty scent of the sea and the aromas of wild herbs growing on the shore. In the distance, in the depths of imagination, one can almost hear the ringing of a church bell, though it should not have existed in that era. It is there, in the picturesque province of Provence, in the south of modern France, that ancient legends begin to emerge and grow stronger. Local residents still pass down whispers of a mysterious holy woman who arrived from the east, carrying a treasure incomparably more precious than any earthly riches, such as gold or precious stones. This treasure was invisible, but its value was immeasurable. Of course, adherents of traditional historical science would likely roll their eyes upon hearing such tales. They would quickly dismiss them as pure folklore, skillfully blended with medieval piety, local vanity, and a generous pinch of romanticism, perhaps fueled by a good Provençal wine. However, even beneath their skeptical laughter, they are forced to acknowledge an undeniable fact. These legends have existed and been passed down for over 1,000 years. This is an extraordinarily long time for any story to withstand the relentless scissors of history and not be completely erased from memory. Thus, we find ourselves on the very edge of a myth that, despite all attempts to refute it, stubbornly refuses to die and continues to live in people's minds. Later, the Templars, mysterious knights associated with enigmatic chapels, strange frescoes depicting women holding not infants, but profound secrets, will appear on the historical stage. They, too, will play their part. But today, it all begins with a fundamental question, with a quiet exhale. What if the bloodline truly survived? If these questions make you ponder, and you find our research intriguing, please support the channel. Subscribe to not miss new fascinating content, and like the video, as it is very important for promotion and development. We would also be glad if you write in the comments where you are watching us from, so we can better understand our audience. And be sure to watch this video until the end, as profound and unexpected conclusions await us in the finale. Links to our other videos can be found in the description. The most potent and significant secrets typically do not require loud declarations or shouts. They exist and are transmitted through subtle gestures, through unfinished symbols, through intricate stone patterns that reveal their full splendor only when the right light falls upon them. Consider, for instance, the labyrinthine paving stones beneath the feet in the famous Chartres Cathedral, where, according to tradition, initiates once embarked on their silent path to enlightenment. But we will return to the mysteries of labyrinths a little later, when the time is right. For now, let us imagine this bloodline, passed down not through the triumphant banners of conquests and resounding declarations, but through cradles cleverly hidden in secluded monasteries, through generations of merchant families, through noble houses, and sometimes, when historical events became too turbulent and dangerous, even among the simplest peasants who guarded it without fully comprehending its immense significance. Initially, it was not about power or the pursuit thereof, at least not in the early stages of this secret lineage's existence. The primary goal was survival, because the very existence of such a bloodline meant constant persecution and the threat of annihilation. After all, Roman popes do not tolerate competing claims to divine right, and kings do not wish to see unpredictable heirs capable of undermining their authority. And yet, through the turbulent oceans of time, this subtle whisper persisted, passed down from one generation to the next. One can think of it as a relay race, where, instead of a traditional baton, a priceless secret is handed over, fragile, absolutely silent, yet of colossal importance. And somewhere in the heart of Europe, this secret was ready to find its protectors, people who wielded swords not only for the liberation of Jerusalem, but for something far more ancient, far quieter, and more sacred. But we will return to the history of the Templars very soon, when the time comes to reveal their true role. The night air is full of questions, isn't it? It faintly smells of beeswax and ink, the very ink scribes used in candlelit scriptoria, diligently copying ancient texts they perhaps were not meant to read at all. One can almost hear the scratching of quills on parchment, the quiet rustle of old scrolls as a monk suddenly pauses, glancing anxiously over his shoulder, fearing discovery. Remember this sense of anticipation and mystery. We will certainly revisit it when our paths lead us to the enigmatic Rennes-le-Château. For now, allow yourself to simply drift along with this story. Imagine this bloodline, passed down not to the sound of trumpets and fanfares, but through quiet lullabies, a bloodline that survives precisely because it never sought a throne and never asserted its claims. It skillfully hid in plain sight, among masons, skilled apothecaries, and, when the critical moment arrived, even among warrior monks who knelt beneath the signs of red crosses. Some historians continue to argue, asserting, what is the point of a bloodline if it never claimed its rights to power? But therein lies the subtle paradox, doesn't it? Perhaps the true strength of this lineage lay precisely in its unpretentiousness, in that quiet challenge that proved capable of outliving entire empires and centuries. And now, as one closes their eyes, Mary Magdalene's boat rocks again on the waves off the Provençal coast. The child is safe for now, but history has a remarkable habit of awakening sleeping secrets. The viewer finds themselves drawn further, delving deeper into this quiet yet persistent question that continues to resonate in the mind. The waves have subsided, but the air still tingles with a salty tang and an unsolved mystery. Imagine Mary Magdalene once more, but not as an icon, rather as a living woman. Her sandals touch the rocky Provençal shore, where the pungent scent of rosemary clings to the morning mist. She is not like the immaculate saint from a stained-glass window. She appears weary yet resolute and, just possibly, she is pregnant. The legend, that stubborn old mule, as it is often called, tells us that Mary Magdalene fled Jerusalem after the crucifixion, carrying within her not only deep sorrow, but also a secret that could potentially overthrow entire empires. There's a version of this legend according to which she lands in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, where she is met not by triumphant trumpets, but by the quiet understanding of simple fishermen and salt-gatherers. Here, she ceases to be merely a repentant sinner, transforming into something much more. The mother of dynasties, whose legacy would secretly influence the course of history. Mainstream historians, of course, are quick to present their academic rebuttals. There is no irrefutable evidence, they insist, claiming it is all merely a product of medieval fantasy. However, evidence, as we know, is not always etched in eternity. Sometimes it resides in unseen lacunae, in stories that old women confide to younger generations when the mistral howls through the tightly shut shutters of old Provençal homes. And this quiet whisper speaks of a sacred womb. The theory posits Mary Magdalene, presumably carrying the descendant of Jesus, was covertly evacuated from the raging maelstrom of events on a boat with a handful of loyal companions. Among them was Joseph of Arimathea, and perhaps a chest containing not jewels, but priceless scrolls holding genealogical records. This family tree, whose branches would soon take root on European soil. You can almost see her, can't you? Wrapped in deep indigo fabric, she protects both her womb and a delicate, fragile future. The boat sways on the waves. The sea rumbles against the hull. But her eyes remain steady, for she knows precisely, true salvation lies not in battle banners and legions of warriors, but in progeny, in carefully guarded secrets, kept safe until the opportune moment. Now, as the narrative snakes its way through the picturesque hills of Provence, it uncovers something curious: the Black Madonna. Images of the Virgin Mary with dark faces begin to appear in the sanctuaries of this region, mysterious and anomalous. Some researchers suggest this is Mary Magdalene, others Isis, rediscovered and venerated. The official church, displaying tactful bewilderment, prefers to steer the conversation away. But these statues do not forget. They stand eternally, silently affirming the existence of a genealogical line, hidden in plain sight. Of course, scholars still engage in ceaseless debates. Was the Black Madonna merely a whim of cultural fashion? A medieval penchant for unusual dyes? Or, as marginal theorists propose, was it a hidden cult of a maternal genealogical branch that the Church dared not name? The path leads through ancient stone settlements, where time slows its pace, where ancient frescoes are covered with a web of cracks, yet their profound meaning remains untouched. In one such chapel, a fresco depicts a woman washing a man's feet, not in a halo of sacred light, but with such intimate ordinariness that it perplexes theologians. A wife, perhaps. Or is it merely an artistic interpretation? Unorthodox historians, those striking thinkers who venture beyond the conventional, meticulously examine these signs, as if searching for lingering traces. For them, Mary Magdalene is not merely a repentant disciple. She is a living vessel, the embodiment of the Holy Grail itself, carrying a genealogical line destined to merge with Europe's most ancient monarchical dynasties. It is here that the threads of the narrative begin to intertwine intricately, bringing the enigmatic Merovingians onto the stage, the Frankish monarchs, famous for their luxurious, uncut hair, surrounded by serpentine symbolism and possessing an inconvenient distinctiveness, were barely tolerated by the church hierarchy. However, theories suggest that these were not merely ambitious warlords. They were guardians of a sacred genealogical line, protectors of Magdalene's progeny, ensuring that this ancestral thread would not be severed by the onslaught of swords, the pressure of papal edicts, or the destructive influence of time. But more about the Merovingians will be told later. For now, imagine the silent conspiracy of mothers and their daughters, generations of women who pass down not only family culinary secrets, but also the intimate mysteries of a bloodline, sacred lullabies preserving the heartbeat of a forgotten dynasty. While kings waged wars, these women nurtured a genuine legacy in the flickering light of kitchen hearths and in sun-drenched vineyards. One can almost hear the subtle creak of old floorboards in an ancient Provençal home. The thick scent of lavender envelops the space as an elderly keeper of the lineage instructs a child. You carry something ancient, my love, something that would be violently suppressed if it were in their power. This is a bloodline that never desired thrones, yet its very existence posed sufficient danger. Historians will engage in endless debates on this matter. Some insist that it is merely a romanticized fabrication, a patchwork quilt of folkloric traditions skillfully stitched together by conspiracy theorists with an abundance of free time and a deficit of convincing evidence. But, oddly enough, these same historians still cannot fully explain the persistent reverence for Mary Magdalene in this region, nor why her unseen presence seems woven into the very stonework. Signs and symbols endure even where irrefutable facts dissolve into the mists of time. And tonight, as her shadow traces the cobblestone alleys, one does not pursue the image of a saint. One follows a woman who survived the collapse of empires not through mighty armies, but through a quiet whisper. The bloodline, if it survived, did not proclaim itself loudly. It hummed softly, patiently awaiting those whose ears could finally catch its melody. Now one feels that subtle pull of an ancient lineage, traversing time, drawing one into its mystery. From the Provençal shores, The path leads to a dynasty whose history is shrouded in mystical secrecy and permeated by serpentine symbolism, the Merovingians. Imagine them not as faceless monarchs lost in the pages of dusty folios, but as embodied, pulsating enigmas. Picture a majestic coronation ceremony in a candlelit basilica, kneeling Frankish aristocrats whose swords reflect the light under towering arches, and at the center, a Merovingian king, his long, never-cut hair flowing over his shoulders like a dark river. This hair, they say, was not merely a fashion statement. It was a sacred symbol, an unbreakable covenant. The longer the hair, the more impeccable their genealogical purity was considered. Historians will remind us that the Merovingians ruled the Franks from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Their legacy is a complex tangle of bloody battles, treacherous betrayals, and constantly shifting borders. They will explain how their power gradually waned, giving way to the more politically astute Carolingians. But what they will not explain, what they cannot explain, is the unyielding presence of serpentine symbolism that entwines this dynasty, like a coiled guardian. Marginal theorists argue that these kings were not merely warlords. They were custodians and protectors of an ancient genealogical line. Their very rule served as a reliable shield for something that predated monarchy itself, something sacred, something profoundly inconvenient for conventional understanding. The serpentine motif, like an invisible thread, permeates Merovingian artifacts, appearing in elegant patterns on bronze buckles, skillfully woven into stained glass compositions, and coiled around solemn royal seals. For some, this symbol represented a remnant of ancient pagan beliefs, embodying ancestral wisdom. For others, it served as a veiled reference to a noble bloodline whose roots, according to tradition, stretched back to the exiled womb of Magdalene. Of course, academic circles tend to be skeptical. Images of snakes, in their view, were widespread in Gallo-Roman art, and linking them to sacred bloodlines seems to them an unfounded stretch. However, perhaps the true anxiety of scholars lies not in the image of the serpent itself. They are troubled by the thought that, deep beneath the outward veneer of medieval Christendom, some ancient, unbroken thread of heritage stubbornly refused to be severed. A traveler might pause in the courtyard of an old abbey, hearing the characteristic crunch of gravel beneath their boots. A Merovingian queen glides past, the train of her deep indigo and crimson velvet cloak rustling against the cold stone. In her hands rests a bronze pendant in the shape of an 8-pointed star, perhaps a simple family heirloom, or perhaps a key to something far more profound. The church, ever vigilant, was uneasy about these long-haired kings. Their staunch refusal to cut their hair was not merely a display of vanity. It was an unambiguous challenge, a quiet yet persistent claim to a legacy that no bishop could excommunicate. And when subtle persuasion proved futile, history, as if sharpening its scissors, took decisive action. The Carolingians ascended the throne, and the Merovingians, according to the official version, vanished from the historical stage. However, history, as is known, rarely ties up loose ends. A persistent theory suggests that although the dynasty was politically overthrown, its bloodline did not end, but merely went underground, dissolving among noble houses, scattering into merchant families, hiding under new coats of arms, but always maintaining its vigilance. And somewhere along this clandestine path, the Knights Templar, those enigmatic guardians in white cloaks, took on the burden of protection. Let us now recall that Black Madonna in the Provençal chapel. Her images were subsequently encountered more frequently in Poland, in Catalonia, even in remote Alpine churches. She was always dark-skinned, always maternal, and always shrouded in mystery. Was she a symbol of universal inclusivity, or a coded message for those who knew where to look? One only had to close their eyes and imagine a Templar chapel nestled in the hills. The air there was cold, thick with the scent of incense. Beneath a fresco of a veiled Madonna, a knight knelt, tracing a finger over the image of a serpent carved into the stone floor. He was not praying for victory. His prayer was dedicated to the preservation of a name, the preservation of a bloodline in the memory of generations. Some scholars still reject such hypotheses. Coincidence, folk tradition, they mumble, dismissively waving their hands. But how many coincidences must overlap before the emerging pattern becomes undeniable? Gradually, an understanding begins to form. The Merovingians were not merely a dynasty, they represented a living cipher. And though their crowns were taken, their secret continued to live in ancient manuscripts, in intricate carvings, in the veiled rituals of those who understood the true stakes. The bloodline never announced itself loudly, but its presence was persistent, like the scent of wax and myrrh that lingers in old stone chapels long after the candles are extinguished. As evening gloom deepens and serpents coil back into the shadows, it becomes clear that the Merovingians never vanished. They simply changed how they moved. And beneath the Templar cross, their bloodline patiently awaited its next guardians. Torchlight flickers on stone as we delve deeper, ever deeper into the silence, deeper into the pulse beating beneath history's skin. The traveler no longer stands in a grand cathedral. They are beneath it, where the air grows colder and denser. The crypt of Rennes-le-Château awaits. Rennes-le-Château, a name that resonates with intrigue. For some, it is merely a quaint hilltop village in southern France. For others, it is a vortex of mysteries, a repository of buried parchments and whispering bloodlines. But this evening, it appears as a labyrinth of shadows, where secrets were once hidden in dry ossuaries and beneath weathered altars. Officially, it is just another village church. Unofficially, well, it has been accused of concealing everything from Templar treasures to the bones of Christ himself. Scholars, of course, will wag their fingers and sigh. Unfounded theories, sensational nonsense. And yet, those same scholars still visit it quietly, discreetly, as if even they sense that the stones here remember far more than they are willing to reveal. The traveler passes under a Romanesque arch, where a Latin inscription twists in almost obliterated letters. This place is truly awesome, not in the sense of unattractive, but in the ancient, primordial meaning of the word. Awesome as in awe-inspiring, as sacred and dangerous. It is here that our story finds a new guardian. Béranger Saunière, a 19th-century parish priest who, according to legend, stumbled upon parchments during the church's restoration. These parchments hinted at a secret so vast it could either redeem kings or bury them forever. Some claim Saunière discovered genealogical records, scrolls of a bloodline tracing not just noble families, but the most noble family. Others suggest they were merely encrypted Templar documents. And of course, there are those who insist he found nothing at all, being simply a priest with a penchant for fundraising and interior embellishment. However, one should look around. Saunier's restorations were quite peculiar. The demonic Asmodeus supported the holy water font. The altar was guarded by statues of Mary Magdalene. Frescoes depicted little-known biblical scenes in a strikingly provocative manner. It is almost as if the walls wink, whispering, "Not everything holy wears a halo." Imagine Saunier, lantern in hand, descending a narrow staircase beneath the altar. His boots echo on the damp stone as he unearths a small wooden chest, sealed with a wax emblem of a serpent coiled around a star. He was not a treasure hunter. He was a guardian, a man who understood that sometimes the most valuable things are not meant to see the light of day. Some say he found a document proving the survival of a royal bloodline descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Others claim it was a map to Templar treasure. Some even whisper it was a book of names, the names of guardians, protectors, bearers of a bloodline that survived inquisitions and excommunications. And here lies the catch that makes historians flinch. Saunier suddenly became rich, mysteriously rich, not as if he had won the village lottery, but as if he were financing lavish church restorations and private libraries. Coincidence? Or was it hush money for a secret too explosive to surface? One can almost hear it now, the screech of iron hinges as a stone slab slides open. Beneath it, a cavity lined with dust and bones, and at its center, wrapped in oiled leather, a scroll, not a gospel, but a genealogical table. Names branching like vines through the centuries, a family tree that should not exist. Of course, skeptics reject all of this. They claim Saunier's fortune came from selling masses, that the treasure is a myth invented by opportunists. But if that were the case, why the enigmatic inscriptions? Why the hidden chambers? Why the skillful reordering of sacred icons into patterns that, to the trained eye, tell a story beyond dogma? It's as if the village itself is a palimpsest, a parchment overwritten but not entirely erased. As one emerges from the crypt, the night air feels different, lighter yet charged. One glances back at the chapel's facade, where two columns stand, Jachin and Boaz. Masonic guardian symbols, or perhaps more ancient, deeper references to safekeeping. One has entered a place where symbols are louder than sermons, where serpents and stars whisper louder than bells. The bloodline here is not a relic. It is alive. It breathes through the mortar, through the sacred geometry that Saunier carved into his church, disguising it as mere decoration. And whether one believes in the parchments or not, the spirit of Rennes-le-Château beckons one to keep asking, what secret was so dangerous, so powerful, that it had to be hidden beneath layers of myth, masonry, and disinformation? As moonlight spills over the village, one feels it, the pulse of a bloodline that never truly slept. One stands beneath the overhanging arches of a Templar commandery. The air is still, yet electrified, as if the very stones are listening. Here whispers become vows. Here legends are forged, not in the grand halls of kings, but in cold, vaulted chambers where secrecy is the first and last rule. The Knights Templar. According to conventional accounts, they were crusaders, warrior monks wielding both sword and scripture. But beneath this polished narrative lies another layer, stubbornly refusing to be erased by time. What if their crusades were about more than just the quest for Jerusalem? What if their true mission was the preservation not of relics, but of a bloodline that could shatter the very hierarchy of Christendom if revealed? The Church called them heretics. The Crown called them a threat. But those in the shadows knew better. The Templars were guardians of a secret, older than any papal decree, and far more dangerous. Imagine a secret council deep within a Templar preceptory. The chamber is circular. The table is carved with an 8-pointed star, the same symbol seen in chapel labyrinths, engraved on hidden vault doors, and etched onto bronze pendants passed down through generations. Torches flicker on the knights' faces. Their eyes are solemn as vows are exchanged in whispers. A single scroll lies at the center of the table, sealed with a crimson wax serpent. This is not a battle plan. It is a genealogical table, a map of lineages tracing back to a disputed source. Mainstream historians would interject here. The Templars were bankers, soldiers, builders, they would argue, not custodians of bloodlines. But this is where the narrative falters. How could a military order accumulate such sudden and immense wealth? How did they gain access to restricted Vatican archives, secure privileges no other order dared to ask for, and construct fortified structures with enigmatic architectural codes? Marginal theorists contend that beneath their militaristic veneer, the Templars functioned as a mobile storage network. The treasures they were accused of appropriating were not golden chalices or jewel-encrusted relics. They were documents, genealogies, keys to a bloodline that, if confirmed, could destabilize both thrones and altars. Take, for example, the persistent legends of Templar ships, laden not with spoils of war, but with crates of sealed scrolls and stone tablets. They sailed not to markets, but to safe harbors, where a bloodline could quietly and continuously endure. One can almost visualize it. A Templar ship sailing in the dead of night, strained by the weight of its hidden mission, moving away from inquisitors towards isolated abbeys where monks understood the stakes. Of course, scholars would caution against this. Correlation does not imply causation. The Templars were simply pragmatic, perhaps. But when one traces the pattern of Templar commanderies, strategically located along ancient pilgrimage routes that coincidentally mirror the presumed migrations of the bloodline, the network becomes harder to dismiss. Within these commanderies, rituals unfolded that were recorded in no book. Protectors of the bloodline were initiated not through grand ceremonies, but through whispered oaths beneath candlelit arches. Symbols, serpents, stars, labyrinths became the true language of these gatherings, invisible to those who sought only swords and coins. There is an old Templar saying, rarely quoted, "Not all treasure is silver." In this light, it gains a weight that no treasury ever possessed. Returning in thought to that council chamber, one can imagine the Grand Master. Clad in simple garments, yet with a keen, sharp gaze, he skillfully unseals an ancient scroll using a blade whose curve resembles a deadly serpent's fang. His voice resonates through the room as he reads aloud, not merely a decree, but a name. A child born in deepest secrecy, carrying a bloodline whose existence the vast majority prefer to deny. This name, once spoken, transforms into an unbreakable oath of protection, forever woven into the sacred vows of every knight present here. In those times, the hostility the Church displayed towards the Templars was not limited to a mere fear of competing power. It was rather a preemptive strike, aimed at those who carried a narrative capable of radically rewriting the very theological foundations of the world. This narrative was embodied not in dry doctrines, but in living flesh and blood. And when King Philip IV of France orchestrated their mass arrests in 1307, the official charges, heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, were merely convenient, pre-prepared words. But behind these accusations lay the true crime: possession. Possession of profound truths that could not be silenced by any papal bull. Certain historians tend to argue that the suppression of the Templar order was purely economic and political in origin. Indeed, their immense wealth was too tempting, and their influence had grown too significant. However, such an explanation appears incomplete and superficial. If the sole purpose was to seize material assets, then why such an overwhelming obsession with destroying every trace of their rituals, symbols, and ancient scrolls? It must be understood that monarchs can forgive greed and even tolerate excessive power. But a secret that questions the very legitimacy of their divine right to the throne cannot be allowed to exist. The greatest treasure of the Templars was not some gilded chalice hidden in a secret vault. It was a humble genealogical table, inconspicuous at first glance, fragile, yet possessing enough power to shatter centuries of established dogma. A document on whose pages was inscribed, "The bloodline continues quietly, relentlessly." As the last flickering torch in that stone chamber finally extinguishes and the knights begin to disperse, it becomes evident that this was no ordinary meeting. It was a solemn affirmation, a profound renewal of an ancient covenant. And somewhere, carefully hidden beneath centuries of architectural structures and historical events, this bloodline continues its existence, protected by the echo of silently uttered vows. Beneath the moonlit sky, where the sea breathes rhythmically, a solitary ship confidently cuts through the dark waves. On its deck stands one of them, his cloak flapping in the gusting wind, sea salt clinging to his lips. This is no ordinary sea voyage, no quest for glory or territorial conquest. This ship seeks complete silence, oblivion. The Templar fleet, only whispered about in shadowy taverns and disbelieved by royal scribes, vanished on just such a night. Official chronicles mentioned arrests and forced confessions, confiscated assets, and punished heretics. However, they remained silent about the fate of those ships that managed to slip away from La Rochelle before the king's men could finally tighten their net. Some marginal historians put forth an intriguing hypothesis. The Templars did not merely flee with gold. They carried with them important documents, priceless relics, and something far more valuable: a living bloodline. Its significance feels particularly acute now. A wooden chest, securely tied under a canvas tarp, is sealed with a wax emblem of a serpent. It is small. It lacks rich adornments. But its contents possess the potential to shatter entire dynasties. Mainstream historians, of course, will declare all this to be nothing more than convenient myth-making. They will insist that no records of a vanished Templar fleet exist, their fingers tracing clean lines on maps that stubbornly refuse to acknowledge the shadows of the past. And yet, the logbooks of La Rochelle contain suspicious gaps. Entire days remain unrecorded, and ships unaccounted for. What if this voyage was the true exodus, not an exodus of a people, but an exodus of a great secret? On deck stand hooded figures, their hands resting not on swords, but on scrolls and sealed chests. They are guardians, couriers of a bloodline that has no place in courts or churches. Every gust of wind feels like an inexorable countdown. Every creak of wood reminds them of the weight of the forbidden blood they carry. Below deck, a veiled woman is hidden, gently holding a small child. Her fingers touch a bronze pendant around the infant's neck, an 8-pointed star entwined with a serpent, not a simple adornment, but a powerful symbol of heritage and immense responsibility. This child is not destined to ascend a throne. Their future will be quieter, but far more dangerous. They are the next, vitally important link in this ancient bloodline. It is at this point that the Church's history begins to show its vulnerability, becoming thin. Why was the persecution of the Templars so sudden, so absolute? Why such incredible urgency? If not for a deep fear that something irreversible was about to slip beneath the sea waves. Marginal theorists point to the sudden, almost ominous silence that enveloped La Rochelle after October 1307. Witnesses suddenly became forgetful. Reports became remarkably vague. As if an invisible hand reached into the annals of history and deliberately blurred the ink, concealing the truth. The ship lists slightly, and a small island appears on the horizon. A place not marked on royal maps, without a name. Perhaps it is a long-forgotten priory. Perhaps just a temporary stop. What matters is that it is a remote, isolated sanctuary, ideal for keeping secrets that should never be officially recognized. The Templars did not need magnificent fortresses. They needed places where truth could hide in plain sight. A stone chapel, a walled garden, a labyrinth carved into the rock. These places became their repositories, and the bloodline continued. Not in the splendid palaces of kings, but in quiet monasteries, under the vigilant care of those who fully understood the gravity and significance of their mission. Delving into the gloomy depths of the ship's hold, one feels the air around them thicken, permeated with the scents of old wax and ancient parchment. Here, among carefully stacked scrolls, wrapped in oiled leather like fragile logs, one's gaze involuntarily falls upon a genealogical table. Unfurled on a modest makeshift altar, it stretches through countless centuries, its ink noticeably faded with time, yet still retaining its resilience. Inscribed upon it are names absent from public chronicles, names whose mere mention in certain royal courts could provoke a fierce inquisition. It becomes clear the Templars sought not merely to escape punishment, they were fleeing complete extermination. Meanwhile, above, the night's darkness seems to whisper of relentless pursuit. Perhaps it is merely the restless breath of the boundless sea, or more likely, the echo of royal ships following them in the pitch black, guided by orders to retrieve not precious gold, but something far more threatening to the established order, a living, breathing truth. Of course, skeptical minds will inevitably raise an eyebrow, pointing to the complete lack of concrete evidence and the suspicious allure of all sorts of conspiracy theories. However, deep within every rejected legend, there invariably lies an elusive kernel of truth, capable of resisting even the most relentless erosion of time. It is a fragment that will not vanish, no matter how diligently one tries to erase its ink. A certain tension is palpable in the air, an invisible weight of centuries pressing down on the fragile wooden hull of the vessel. This ship carries not merely people or valuable artifacts, it carries a contradiction, a living paradox that boldly challenges the neatness and order of official history. As it approaches the island, torchlight begins to flicker along its stark, rocky shore. There, waiting, stand hooded figures, their hands empty but burdened with deep anticipation. On this day, the bloodline will quietly, without fuss, pass from one guardian to another. Without fanfare, without recorded ceremony, simply the silent transfer of a secret too dangerous to be entrusted to scrolls alone. The ship glides smoothly into a hidden cove, where the sound of the surf is barely audible, muffled by jagged rocks. Ropes are thrown, chests are lifted, scrolls are carefully packed. The child, carrying a crucial part of this heritage, disembarks last, carried, hidden beneath the folds of a simple woolen cloak. No banners, no trumpets announce this event, and yet, history subtly, yet irreversibly, turns. As the ship dissolves into the mist, it becomes clear this was not a flight in the usual sense, but rather a migration of truth. The movement of something that steadfastly refuses to be silenced. And now, even buried beneath the boundless oceans of time, one finds oneself beneath the cold vault of a mountain abbey, where every breath feels like an intrusion. Inside the abbey, the air becomes particularly sharp, permeated not only with the scent of beeswax, but with something far more ancient, perhaps damp stone, or the faint trace of incense that seems not to have burned here for centuries. It is here, beneath these vaults, that certain secrets sleep, or perhaps they merely skillfully feign sleep. The abbey itself is practically unmarked on royal maps, as if erased from official history. Built on a granite ridge, it is an impregnable fortress, cleverly disguised as a modest place of prayer. But the monks who reside here are by no means ordinary brothers. Their vows extend far beyond simple silence and poverty. They are vigilant guardians of a heritage that does not fit into traditional psalms. Mainstream historians often dismiss such places as mere monastic eccentricities or relics of feudal patronage. However, upon careful examination of certain patterns, one can notice that these remote priories are suspiciously clustered along long-forgotten pilgrimage routes that, as marginal theorists claim, served as hidden arteries for the bloodline, permeating all of Europe in a secret network of sanctuaries and refugees. One moves through a narrow corridor, fingers gliding over walls that seem to breathe with stories. At the end of this path, a modest, almost unfurnished room is discovered, where the only piece of furniture is a stone pedestal. Upon it rests a bronze reliquary casket, on which the motif of the serpent and star faintly gleams in the dim light, symbolizing a quiet yet persistent resistance to the centuries that have tried to consign it to oblivion. Certain scholars, adhering to traditional views, unequivocally assert that it is precisely here that myths finally go too far. They insist on the complete absence of any credible evidence capable of linking these remote rural abbeys to the Templar exodus, clinging to their academic citations. However, the question arises, what if true evidence is not always found in ink and parchment? What if it manifests in the very architecture, in deliberate structural discrepancies, in enigmatic labyrinthine engravings on floor tiles, in chapel apses that are oriented not towards sacred Jerusalem, but towards distant, nebulous constellations? At this moment, a monk appears, his hood pulled low over his face, his steps utterly silent. He carries a scroll case, skillfully crafted from old oak and tied with crimson silk. He presents it not with ostentatious ceremony, but with a quiet, almost weary reverence, as if this transfer has been repeated from generation to generation, invariably preserving the same sacred solemnity. One can notice his fingers lingering slightly on the silk knot. This is not a sign of reluctance, but a deep understanding, For as soon as this scroll leaves his hands, another link in a centuries-old chain of silence is released into the world beyond the abbey walls, vulnerable yet invincible. The scroll itself, contrary to expectations, turns out to be by no means a grandiose tome. It is brief in volume, yet its faded ink carries centuries of defiance and resistance. Names are recorded with meticulous care, deliberately avoiding titles, and genealogies are documented not for pride, but solely to ensure continuity. The moment arrives when one holds this scroll, and its weight seems disproportionate to its modest size. This sensation is akin to what a scribe in Alexandria might have experienced, watching in horror as merciless flames devoured a priceless library. It is not merely the loss of paper, but the loss of breath itself, the loss of unspoken yet living stories. Outside, the wind howls mournfully through the monastery arches, and this sound is perceived as a sinister warning. Marginal theorists hypothesize that the survival of this bloodline was the result not of large-scale, carefully planned conspiracies, but of countless small, yet deliberate acts of protection. It could have been a mother passing a precious pendant to her child, a monk hiding a scroll beneath a floorboard, or a knight choosing exile over a treacherous confession. Within the walls of this abbey, each of these choices finds its echo. One theory suggests that certain monastic orders were never fully absorbed into the dominant ecclesiastical hierarchy. They remained on the periphery, operating in the background, preserving oral histories, symbols, and rituals that were too dangerous to be publicly written. The monks residing here are capable of reading Latin prayers, but their true liturgy is unwritten. It is passed down by word of mouth, skillfully veiled in ritual gestures and encrypted hymns. Of course, academics will undoubtedly scoff at such claims, declaring them romantic nonsense and pointing to the complete absence of written doctrine. However, perhaps this is precisely the point. Some truths, by their very nature, are simply not meant for ink. The traveler found himself in a modest apothecary's room, its air infused with the aromas of medicinal herbs. The shelves of this chamber were lined with numerous glass vials, filled with mysterious elixirs and bundles of dried herbs. Initially, this circumstance did not attract much attention. However, then his gaze fell upon the faint, yet undeniable outline of a serpent, skillfully carved into the massive central beam of the apothecary. With time, the carving had almost worn away, but its contours remained unmistakable. It became evident that this room served not only for physical healing. The monk, as if reading his thoughts, pointed to an ancient goatskin map spread on a simple wooden table. It bore neither familiar state borders nor outlines of kingdoms, but rather an enigmatic grid of symbols. 8-pointed stars shimmered alongside coiled serpents. Chalices coexisted with intricate labyrinths. This was not a geographical map in the usual sense. It was a map of memory, etched onto parchment. Each of these signs pointed to a hidden place where the threads of an ancient bloodline were carefully preserved. Some of them represented majestic abbeys, others gloomy caves, deep wells, or even seemingly unremarkable crossroads. His finger glided over the mysterious symbols, feeling how an invisible web of connections stretched across the entire European continent, penetrating impassable mountain passes and hiding beneath centuries-old city stones. The essence lay not in the end point of the route, but in the unbreakable bond uniting these places. The monk remained silent, but in the air, the question invisibly lingered. Would he be able to remember what even ink dared not express? Meanwhile, the muffled ringing of abbey bells echoed from afar. Their melody, softened by distance, nevertheless resonated deeply within his soul. This was not a haven for loud declarations, but rather a sanctuary of quiet, unwavering persistence. Now he began to realize that the true resilience of the bloodline had almost nothing to do with dynastic alliances or secret nocturnal vows. It survived thanks to these forgotten, hidden sanctuaries, where history was preserved not in dusty archives, but in breath itself, in living memory, in reverent silence. When he returned to the corridor, the reliquary casket still rested on its pedestal, devoid of visible guard, yet remaining utterly inviolable. Its very presence here seemed a silent rebellion, a silent reminder that not all true treasures are adorned with crowns or rest beneath majestic cathedral domes. The ancient bloodline was not hiding. It was patiently awaiting its hour. He followed the monk into a narrow passage, where the stone walls seemed to inexorably constrict, striving to engulf the space. Every stone here seemed to breathe history, touching another, and each subsequent step echoed in the air with a sense of exaggerated, almost mystical importance. The air gradually became colder and damper, acquiring a faint metallic taste. He was once again descending into the depths of the earth, and by this point, he knew firmly that it was precisely in such hidden places that true untold stories preferred to conceal themselves. Deep beneath the abbey, a vault indeed lay, yet it was by no means the grand, echoing treasury one might imagine. On the contrary, it turned out to be modest, with a low ceiling, its walls lined not with gleaming gold, but with simple niches. In each niche rested a small, unassuming chest, crafted from wood and bound with iron bands, some barely larger than a loaf of bread. No intricate carvings or jewel inlays were visible, only simple, unpretentious receptacles for forgotten legacies. Some marginal historians dubbed them bone libraries, not because they necessarily contained bones, though who could know for sure, but because they held the very essence of stories, the genetic code of ancient dynasties. These humble chests held no treasures in the conventional royal sense. They carefully preserved genealogical markers, ancient rings with serpents, intricately engraved chalices, fragments of old parchment covered with mysterious family seals. However, mainstream historians adhering to a more pragmatic approach named them less poetically monastic relic archives, names dry, sterile, purely academic. They meticulously cataloged the contents, added footnotes to their inventories, but completely overlooked the very essence of these artifacts. For these were not just museum exhibits, but rather breadcrumbs leading along the trail of a forgotten history. He paused before one of the niches where the chest lid was slightly ajar. The monk, noticing his attentive gaze, silently and cautiously lifted the lid. Inside, on a neatly folded piece of goatskin, lay a small bronze pendant. The pendant was adorned with an 8-pointed star, skillfully intertwined with a coiled serpent. This emblem had appeared for many centuries, sometimes on the margins of little-known manuscripts, sometimes subtly carved into the lintels of ancient chapels, sometimes secretly worn by representatives of certain noble lineages. It was around this symbol that fierce scholarly debates raged. The serpentine star, some argued, represented a Templar interpretation of the ancient Eastern Ouroboros symbol. These researchers cited ancient trade routes and processes of cultural diffusion as proof of their theory. Others, on the contrary, insisted that it was an inherently merovingian artifact, a sacred symbol of sovereign blood, which had been appropriated and carefully concealed by the Templars after the tragic fall of Jerusalem. This dispute, it seemed, was almost as ancient as the chest itself, guarding the mystery. He carefully took the goatskin scroll. The scroll crackled softly under his fingers, its texture dry and fibrous, reminiscent of the skin of some long-extinct creature. The ink on it was heavily faded, but the inscription remained quite legible, and the script was neither Latin nor Greek. It was a cipher, a mysterious language of glyphs, intended not for mass reading, but for memorization by only the chosen, the initiated. The monk, meanwhile, lit a small oil lamp resting on a stone shelf. The lamp's soft light spread through the room, gradually revealing faint engravings on the wall behind the chest. This was not a geographical map, but rather a genealogical one, with intersecting spirals and knots marked with symbols instead of names. Perhaps it was a family tree or an intricate labyrinth. In any case, its essence lay in living, unbroken connections. At this moment, a strange, inexplicable warmth filled the room, as if the very walls responded to the lamp's living light, exhaling ancient secrets they had held in their cold silence for so long. The monk pointed to one of the knots, marked with the familiar serpentine star. This knot was located neither at the root of the labyrinth nor at its end. It seemed to float somewhere in the middle, representing a key junction where numerous paths converged. Some marginal theorists hypothesized that this was evidence of a parallel command structure within the Templar order, a secret order whose purpose was to preserve the ancient bloodline and which operated completely silently, hiding beneath the visible hierarchy of knights, commanders, and grandmasters. It was a network of guardians whose oaths of loyalty were pledged not to Rome, but directly to the bloodline itself. A true secret, hidden within another secret. The disbelieving murmur of modern historians of the past is almost audible in the depths of one's consciousness. It's just an allegory, they would probably declare, a medieval contemplation on metaphorical spiritual renewal. But then a legitimate question arises. Why conceal it in a secret vault beneath an abbey, meticulously encrypted, securely sealed, and passed down from generation to generation in barely audible whispers? The clergyman closes the casket with the utmost care. It has no lock. In this, essentially, there is no need. The invisible power of ancient traditions surpasses the strength of any metal clasp. He has an unwavering premonition that if someone were truly meant to discover the contents of these hidden places, they would be initiated into their secrets. And if not, the casket simply would not reveal its hidden story. As he ascends back into the central cloister, a stark contrast unfolds before his eyes. Bright sunbeams generously illuminate the stone slabs, and the multi-voiced chorus of distant bells reminds him of the world spread out above, bustling markets, political intrigues, inspired sermons, and omnipresent skepticism. But deep beneath his feet, an invisible and indomitable bloodline continues its mysterious, silent journey. In certain, very closed circles, a rumor circulates that not all ancient bloodlines are recorded in official royal chronicles. Some are preserved by the conscious choice of their bearers, rather than by the inalienable right of the crown. These are chosen lineages that, for many generations, consciously rejected lavish titles, vast estates, and worldly fame, harmoniously weaving their destinies into the daily life of villages, sacred abbeys, and influential merchant guilds. The serpent and star pendants are not merely family heirlooms intended to symbolize ancestral pride. They rather act as invisible compasses, silent reminders of a profound responsibility that significantly outlives fleeting earthly glory. Before he leaves this place, the monk delicately places a hand on his shoulder. He says nothing. There is no need. The touch itself becomes a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of a profound truth. History is not a linear progression. It spirals, hides in the shadows, and then reappears in the light. Stepping out into the sunlit space, he realizes that his view of the surrounding landscape has irrevocably changed. Every ancient stone chapel, every bustling market square, even the barely discernible time-worn carvings on the rim of an old well, all these now cease to be mere background scenery. They transform into silent witnesses. This bloodline was never about power, dominion, or conquest. Its essence lies in unwavering endurance, a legacy that survives not through brute force, but like a quiet underground stream that imperceptibly yet relentlessly alters rock, whisper by whisper, over millennia. And now he carries a part of this unseen current. The path leads him ever higher into the winding folds of the Languedoc hills, where the wind transforms into an unseen accomplice, carrying mysterious whispers through dense cypress groves. He pauses before a majestic ruin, an ancient chapel whose roof long ago succumbed to the ravages of time, but whose stone bones stand defiantly, its massive ribbed vaults stubbornly arching towards the sky. This place is not for curious tourists. There are no information plaques, no organized tours, only the slow, inevitable decay of history, surrendered to the mercy of relentless elements. Yet, beneath this seeming abandonment, a subtle pulse is felt. He steps inside. The air here grows cooler and noticeably denser. The light softens, filtering through the gaping openings of broken arches and painting the stone floor with fragmented mosaics of golden and gray hues. He instantly feels something strange, a premonition of being watched intently. Though there is no one around, at least no visible beings. The main nave of the chapel stretches into the distance, its floor paved with ancient stone slabs, worn smooth by countless centuries of human steps. However, his guide, the taciturn brother who followed him from the abbey, points not forward, but directs his gaze downward. His finger indicates a massive slab situated near the altar, its edges intricately marked with mysterious symbols. There is a cross, but not an ordinary one, rather intricately intertwined with a serpent, and an 8-pointed star, comfortably nested within its coils. Those referred to as marginal historians interpret this symbol as a sign of ancient preservation. Official academic science resolutely rejects such an interpretation, declaring it merely a decorative element, a peculiar deviation of a local craftsman, as they claim. But he begins to realize that it is precisely in such deviations that truth often prefers to hide. With a concerted effort, the slab slowly moves, revealing a narrow descent into an underground chamber, which resembles a gaping wound in the earth more than an ordinary room. He descends, and the air around him grows colder, until the stone walls begin to gleam dully with emerging moisture. And now before him appears a stone elevation, upon which rests a mysterious chalice. It is not adorned with gold or precious stones. It is simply stone, gray, with faint veins of weak crimson lines, as if the material itself holds memories of blood. The chalice itself is unassuming, but its invisible presence absolutely dominates this confined space. This is not merely an exhibit. It is a silent yet powerful statement. Some researchers claim that such stone chalices are merely ordinary medieval communion vessels, created purely for practical reasons. Others, however, whisper that these are ancestral vessels intended to hold not wine, but the heritage itself, blood in its most literal and sacred sense. He approaches closer, carefully examining the labyrinth carved into the floor around the elevation. The labyrinth, spiraling outwards, has lines so faint that they are almost erased by the relentless passage of time. This labyrinth is designed not to confuse the mind, but to help trace a path. It is a map of a bloodline, echoing the enigmatic glyphs of the serpentine star he had already seen in the monastic vault. In this place, theoretical investigations diverge in diametrically opposite directions. One school of thought suggests that the labyrinth serves as an indicator of the secret Templar bloodline's hideouts, marking a clandestine pilgrimage route that stretches from the Pyrenees to the rugged highlands of Scotland. The other theory, considerably more poetic in its essence, asserts that the labyrinth symbolizes the inner journey of the chosen bloodline, a path of profound spiritual awakening, skillfully encoded in stone. He kneels beside the carved labyrinth, carefully tracing its faint lines with his finger. The stone beneath his touch feels warm, even unnaturally warm. He reflects on the scribe in the monastic library, on the enigmatic serpentine tokens, on the pendant he held in his hands earlier. These are not merely ancient relics. They are more like guiding breadcrumbs. Above him, through the exposed skeletal-like rafters, the sky changes. Clouds part, and a powerful beam of light pierces the ruins, falling directly onto the mysterious chalice. The crimson veins on its surface begin to glow faintly, like barely smoldering embers disturbed by the wind. One could call this a simple coincidence, but such an explanation would be too superficial and lazy. This place, it seems, was created precisely for such moments of revelation. As he rises, his guide breaks his silence for the first time in hours. It is not hidden, he says, his voice quiet but imbued with unwavering firmness. It merely waits. A realization, like an invisible shadow, remains with the person as they step back into the sunlit expanse. Historical chronicles often portray the Templars as financial magnates, valiant warriors, or pliable political pawns. However, the idea that they perceived themselves as guardians, custodians of something that significantly transcended worldly gold and earthly power, is not as romantic as it might initially seem. This thought causes a certain discomfort. It mercilessly shatters neat, carefully constructed historical narratives. Imagine, for example, that the chalice resting beneath these ancient ruins is not the legendary Holy Grail in its Arthurian sense, but rather an anchor of a bloodline, a vessel symbolizing continuity, a physical marker of a genealogical line that consciously chose patient waiting over the thirst for power. In light of such an interpretation, the Templars appear not as guardians of some sacred relic. They were, in essence, guardians of a choice. The person leaves the ancient chapel, but its invisible weight relentlessly follows them. Every stone, every engraved symbol, every whisper of the wind feels like a fragment of an unfinished phrase, awaiting its logical conclusion. The image of the labyrinth, a map that is not really a map, floats into memory, and the understanding comes that history was never about finding a final destination. It was always about reading between the lines, about understanding those very gaps. A bloodline is not just a relic to be unearthed from the ground. It is a complex pattern, a rhythm, a strong thread that constantly returns to itself, stubbornly refusing to be broken. And in these ruins, open to the boundless sky, breathing eternity, this thread still palpably pulsates. The road gently descends into the valley, where the sunlight takes on a softer, golden hue, heralding the afternoon quiet, from which even the stones feel warm underfoot, as if the earth itself breathes slowly and rhythmically. One walks along a narrow path, bordered by slender cypresses and fragrant lavender. Every gust of wind releases a symphony of subtle aromas, herbs, stirred dust, and the faint scent of old incense, wafting from some long-forgotten altar. Ahead, through the greenery, the outline of an estate emerges, but it is not a majestic castle of kings. It is something far more subtle and elegant, half fortress, half sanctuary. Its ochre stone walls are thickly entwined with ivy, and the towers, though modest in size, appear vigilant and sturdy. This place once served as a Templar commandery, though now it skillfully masquerades as an ordinary wine estate. The locals, of course, whisper about its mysterious past, but only when the wine flows freely, loosening their guard. One is met by a woman, neither nun nor knight, but simply a guardian, dressed in plain attire. Her hands are stained with grape must, but her gaze is sharp as any sword's blade. She leads the guest into the courtyard, where the air is thick with the mingled scents of ripening fruit and cooling stone. The heart of this estate, she explains, lies not in its grapevines, but deep beneath them. The true harvests gathered here are not meant for bottling. She carefully slides aside a massive stone slab located near an old well, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase leading into impenetrable shadow. The walls grow colder and damper as one descends, echoing with a low hum, as if the earth itself holds ancient memories. Torches flare, their living glow dancing over ancient frescoes that by all laws of time should not have survived for so long. These are not triumphant scenes of crusading knights, nor the sorrowful martyrdoms so beloved by ecclesiastical artists. No, these are maps, intricate, deeply symbolic, serpentine. Bloodlines depicted not as traditional family trees, but as powerful, flowing rivers, winding, merging, and then diverging again. One of these rivers particularly captures attention. It meanders through symbols that are already familiar: the serpent, the eight-pointed star, the chalice, and something entirely new: a tree whose roots entwine a crown, a bold assertion rendered in pigment. Official historical science typically dismisses these frescoes, considering them merely allegorical depictions, artistic reflections on spiritual journeys. However, marginal scholars perceive in them something far more precise. A visual code that traces the transmission of sacred bloodlines through dynasties, skillfully disguised as mere nobility. The woman points to a symbol hidden in a corner, a red cross entwined with a laurel wreath. This, she states, was never a symbol of war. It was a signature, a claim of origin. Her voice is matter of fact, as if she is discussing a harvest. Not the potential heirs of a figure widely believed to have left no heirs at all. The debate, of course, is quite sharp. Some researchers argue that the Templars used these symbols to assert a purely spiritual lineage, not a biological one. Others, whose voices are less frequently heard in academic discussions, believe these were literal markers of blood, cleverly veiled in allegory for survival. One feels a familiar, pressing weight descending onto the chest. The same weight as in the crypt beneath the abbey, the same weight as in the chapel labyrinth. Each new place reveals another thread, another echo. At the very center of the chamber stands an ancient wooden chest, its lid adorned with an exquisite carving of a serpentine star. There are no locks on it, merely a simple wax seal, dark crimson in color, with the imprint of a laurel cross. The woman carefully opens it, revealing inside not gold or jewels, but scrolls, dozens of them, tightly bound, their goatskin covers worn, their edges darkened by the touch of centuries. One reaches out for one of them, feeling its rough yet familiar texture. The writing on it is neither Latin nor Old Occitan, but encrypted, an alphabet of symbols only glimpsed in the margins of Templar manuscripts. It is a language not meant for ordinary reading, but for memorization, a code carried by people, not etched on paper. Scholars still debate whether these ciphers were ever fully deciphered. Some suggest that the knowledge was intentionally fragmented across generations, with each guardian possessing only a part of the whole. Others believe that the entire code lives in oral traditions, cleverly disguised as folk tales or chants performed during harvest. One imagines the Templars after their fall, scattering like sparks, each carrying a scroll, a song, a story, vanishing into the very fabric of Europe, not erased from memory, but merely silenced. In the confined chamber, where the air felt palpable, the scroll in the visitor's hands transformed an abstract concept into something tangible. The bloodline, it turned out, was not an ancient relic to be unearthed. It represented a complex pattern, skillfully hidden in plain sight, in family traditions, in rituals, in barely audible blessings that most people mistakenly took for mere superstitions. The guardian, having completed her actions, carefully closed the chest. "Wine it ferments," she said with an enigmatic, sly smile. "But some vintages they breathe." Outside this underground space, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the valley, like fingers that seemed to pull all secrets back into the depths of the earth. The visitor left the chamber, but the air around him felt different, as if the earth itself was intently observing his departure, assessing its significance. The Templars did not disappear without a trace. They dissolved into the roots, into the stones, into long-forgotten rituals, cleverly disguised as local customs. The bloodline never needed protection in the usual sense of the word. It only required patience, passing by rows of grapevines, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. The visitor realized, somewhere deep beneath his feet, these scrolls continued to be preserved, awaiting the moment when another inquisitive mind would ask a question capable of penetrating to the very core. And he, not for the first time, wondered, are history's greatest secrets not so much about their concealment, but about waiting for the right questions to bring them to light? The wind here at the summit had a different quality, higher, thinner, as if the air itself refused to carry sounds. The visitor stood at the peak of Montségur, a fortress that, according to the victors, was a refuge not for kings, but for heretics. The Cathars, the pure ones, once called this citadel home, perched defiantly on a rocky crag that cleaved the sky like a sharp blade. However, the visitor had come here for more than just the Cathars. The stone beneath his boots was warm, almost alive, whispering tales of countless sieges, betrayals, and, if whispers were to be believed, a treasure that was secretly spirited away right from under the nose of ecclesiastical authorities. Montségur, it turned out, was where the Templars learned a crucial lesson. When the walls begin to burn, the most precious things must already be safely carried away. Sharp sunlight pierced the air, but the guide, an elderly man with a raspy voice, directed the visitor into a shadowed niche, roughly carved into the rock. His torch flared with a low crackle, illuminating a tunnel that spiraled downwards, where damp air enveloped the traveler like a shroud. The passage seemed to breathe with each step, and so did the weight of history. Here, according to legend, the Cathars entrusted the Templars with something far more significant than mere gold. It was a secret, a relic, a scroll, perhaps even a person. No inventory list remained, and that was the whole point. The visitor reached a chamber where the air felt unnaturally still. An 8-pointed star, intertwined with a serpent, was carved into the wall, and beneath it lay a stone slab, polished smooth by centuries of reverent touch. Mainstream historians, with their predictable pragmatism, dismissed this as symbolic Cathar art, merely an aesthetic motif devoid of any deep meaning. However, marginal theorists suggested that this was a meeting place, a kind of staging post where relics of both Cathar and Templar bloodlines were transferred to new safekeeping, away from the inquisitorial flames. The guide smiled, not to explain anything, but to see if the visitor understood. He produced a goatskin map from his pouch. Its ink was faded, but its geometry remained clear. It was not a map of territories, but a map of alignments, stellar patterns, ley lines, sacred sites linked together across France, Spain, and beyond. He pointed to Montségur's location. They called it the Grail Castle, the guide said softly. Not for a golden chalice, but for the Grail, an old Occitan word for a vessel, a container of sacred essence, not necessarily an object, perhaps a bloodline. Academic debate still rages as to whether the Cathar-Templar alliance was more than a romantic fabrication, a post-Crusader fantasy woven by those who rejected neat Roman narratives. But the timing, the roots, the recurring symbols, all pointed to a coordination too precise to be mere coincidence. The air in the chamber grew colder, as if the mountain itself was listening. The visitor's fingers touched the stone slab, feeling indentations worn much deeper than one would expect. These were traces of repeated use, of rituals performed not once, but hundreds of times. The guide knelt, pressing his hand to the slab, and it shifted, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside, a bronze reliquary casket, adorned with a cross entwined with a laurel wreath, rested on velvet, long faded to gray. Its lid swung open smoothly, revealing a single item, a ring, not gold, but iron. Its band was inscribed with serpentine glyphs and set with a stone the color of dried blood. Simple, humble, utterly insignificant to looters. But to those who understood the symbols, it was a coronation in miniature. The visitor lifted the ring, feeling its weight, or rather its disproportionate lightness. A ring is easy to hide, easier still to pass down, and easiest of all to dismiss. Some argued that the idea of a Grail bloodline was pure myth, a misreading of poetic metaphors run wild. But those same scholars could not explain why certain families in certain valleys still utter prayers mentioning a mother of the lineage, long after official doctrine had forgotten her existence. When the visitor placed the ring back in its bed, the guide almost casually mentioned that similar rings had been found in places as far-flung as Scotland and Portugal. Coincidence? A network? Or simply artifacts of a belief system that refused to die no matter how many towers were burned? Outside, the wind shifted again, intensifying, as if to remind that Montségur's story was not merely a relic. It was a living tension, a thread still humming beneath the surface, vibrating through stone and blood. The visitor stepped out into the sunlight, blinking, but the shadow of that chamber clung to him. Each step down the mountain felt heavier, as if gravity pulled harder than usual. Now he understood why the Templars chose to hide their treasures in plain sight, not in vaults, but in rituals, songs, and humble rings worn by peasants and stonemasons. And he began to wonder how many people pass by these symbols every day, their eyes clouded by centuries of enforced forgetting, while the true guardians quietly smile, knowing the true weight of what they carry. The valley stretching below seems boundless, like an eternal canvas. Before one's eyes unfolds a magnificent tapestry of green and gold, its patterns precisely mirroring those etched on the ancient map. Clearly, history has not ended. It has merely found a new voice, having changed its usual narrative language. One stands on the edge of a windswept cliff, commanding a majestic view of the Pyrenees, sprawling below like a giant tapestry carved from stone. The air carries the fresh scent of sea salt, mingled with the spicy notes of mountain sage. Somewhere far below, ancient trails wind through deep gorges, where for centuries, like an echo, the whispers of past events have gathered in the moss. Today, however, the gaze is not directed downward to earthly paths. It is aimed upward to the high vaults of history, where a mysterious dynasty once soared beneath the shadow of papal thrones and royal crowns. Imagine a coronation in Avignon, not a lavish ceremony with golden scepters, but a clandestine act performed within stone walls, known only to a select circle of initiates. This was a bloodline, traced not through dusty scrolls and genealogical trees, but through the hushed breaths of people who had sworn an oath of silence. A Templar bloodline, whose blood flowed in the veins of monarchs, yet whose existence was declared invisible by decree of Rome. Some historians, adhering to traditional views, might claim this is nothing more than pure legend, asserting that dynasties are built on the strength of armies and treaties, not on hidden parchments and secret rites. However, if one listens to the voices of the archivists of Rennes-le-Château, they will point to the Testament of the Shepherd, a goatskin document sealed with 8-pointed stars. In it, bloodlines, like serpents, coil from Jerusalem through Merovingian vaults and into the hands of a Templar named Bertrand. Notably, he was not a nobleman. He was a simple stonemason, yet a guardian of the cipher. Imagine Bertrand, lantern in hand, confidently striding through an underground chamber beneath a forgotten Languedoc monastery. The walls there are rough, unpolished by wealth, but his steps are resolute. He knows precisely where the vault is. It is not a treasury of gold, but a place housing a carved reliquary bearing a symbol the Church calls heresy, a chalice entwined with vines and guarded by a serpent. The tension between what is carved in stone and what is preached from pulpits is palpable, isn't it? Here, in the cool breath of the stone, Templar artisans wove their protest not with swords, but with chisel strokes intended to outlast papal decrees. Bertrand's hands, calloused from cement dust, were the hands of a king-creator, a quiet rebel whose art spoke louder than words. And yet, while scholars debate the existence of such reliquaries, a collapsed abbey vault reveals frescoes that clearly do not conform to the official ecclesiastical narrative. They depict serpents holding stars and crosses entwined with vines. To the layman, it is merely a decaying medieval fresco. But to the guardian of the bloodline, it is a true map, pointing to hidden truths. The Church prefers to categorize such symbols as folk heresies, as if faith itself can be packaged and neatly shelved. However, faith is a slippery, elusive substance. It hides in stone crevices and in ancient chants, awaiting those with the right eyes to see it. Bertrand's reliquary would disappear from official records, but centuries later, it would resurface in whispers of a serpentine chalice, passed from hand to hand among French resistance priests, hidden beneath chalice coverings during Mass. Irony, like a golden thread, weaves itself into these legends. The same relic condemned by Rome was consecrated by those who risked their lives to preserve it. The air around grows colder. One can almost feel the frost seeping through Bertrand's cloak as he seals the vault for the last time, pressing a red wax seal onto the stone slab. The wax is ordinary, but the gesture is not. It is a farewell to a bloodline that must survive in the shadows. Above him, monastery bells ring, but their chime does not mark time. It signals danger. The Inquisition has ears everywhere. Bertrand does not flee. He disappears into the tunnels, into the myths, into the anonymity of a guild of builders whose fingers extended into every cathedral across Europe. Some argue that these stories intertwine a dozen unrelated threads: mystical orders, political exiles, apocryphal gospels, stitched into a grand conspiracy quilt. Perhaps. But why does the same serpentine chalice symbol appear in cathedrals 3 centuries apart, on different continents, always in places where Templar hands once shaped stone? And why does Bertrand's name surface in Parisian archives centuries later, inscribed not as a stonemason, but as a keeper of sacred vessels? It's easy to get lost in these labyrinths of maybes and might-haves. But tonight, in the silence between heartbeats, one should walk these paths with reverence. One should imagine that Bertrand's lantern still glows beneath that abbey, not as a relic of the past, but as a torch passed from hand to hand by those who refuse to forget. The bells fall silent, the mist thickens, and in that quiet, the bloodline continues to breathe. One follows the map, not just with their eyes, but with their breath, their fingertips. The parchment feels alive, as if every fold and ink stroke carries a pulse, leading not to a specific place, but to a specific moment. This is not a path marked by borders and roads, but a collection of symbols, serpents, stars, chalices, woven into the very fabric of forgotten corners of Europe. Each symbol represents a door. And today, one stands before one of them. Ahead rises a monastery, carved into a basalt cliff. Its presence is so unassuming that it seems to vanish in plain sight. Locals call it the Hollow Abbey, a place where light and shadow intertwine secret stories into the stone. One passes through an arched gate, whose keystone is carved with a Templar cross intertwined with a serpent, a symbol over which scholars still fiercely debate. Was it merely a motif of medieval artisans, or a veiled emblem of a teaching that blended Christian and pre-Christian wisdom? The debate echoes in ivory towers, but here it is carved into the rock, unmoved by academic quarrels. The abbey breathes with a cold dampness. The walls seem to sweat secrets they have held since the last Templar caravan passed through. And in that echo, a dry, papery laugh escapes one's lips. The path is not just old, it is alive, and it laughs at those who think history remains buried. The researcher enters the ancient scriptorium. Silence reigns here, broken only by the faint rustle of long, silent quills, whose ghostly rhythm seems to linger in the air like a distant memory. Mighty shelves sag under the impressive weight of parchment manuscripts. Among them are herbals, cosmologies, and those enigmatic hybrid texts that scholars so love to classify as pseudepigrapha when their footnotes don't align with conventional expectations. Attention is drawn to one of the stone panels. It is significantly smoother than its neighbors and completely free of dust, as if specifically awaiting a touch. The researcher inserts a bronze token, depicting a serpent coiled around a chalice, into a specially designed recess. The wall emits a slow, drawn-out groan, reluctantly parting, and a hidden passage exhales cold air onto the traveler's skin. The scent lingering in the air feels familiar. Old paper, beeswax, and something metallic. Perhaps it is a deep, almost blood memory. Inside, a modest chamber is discovered. There are no gilded altars or jewel-encrusted reliquaries here, only a simple wooden chest. Its lock is fashioned in the shape of a serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros. Some historians argue that the Knights Templar adopted this symbol from Gnostic sects, while others categorically reject it, calling it pagan nonsense. However, here, in this sacred abode, it is neither. It is simultaneously a key, a warning, and a promise. When the chest opens, there are no fanfares or flashes of divine light. Only a bundle of scrolls is revealed, neatly tied with red silk and sealed with crimson wax. The seal bears the image of an 8-pointed star, an emblem that refuses to be tamed by a single faith or faction. Christians, Sufis, Kabbalists, all have at various times tried to lay claim to it. And yet, it rests here, in its quiet indifference, as if silently asking the one who sees it who they are to determine its true nature. The scrolls unfurl with a certain resistance, revealing something that is both a map and not a map. It is rather a constellation, meticulously charted on the Earth's surface. Here are lines of pilgrimage, like ley lines, and nodes where sacred geometry seems to touch the very earth. The researcher carefully traces this intricate pattern. It marks Rennes-le-Château, Orval Abbey, and the Church of Mary Magdalene in Vézelay. A triangulation of stories too incredible for textbooks, yet too persistent to remain mere legends. A faint smile appears on his lips. Some might call this a pointless pursuit, a wild goose chase. But he knows something more. Geese, as is known, fly in formation, and even in their seeming chaos, there is astonishing precision. As the researcher rolls up the scroll, a tiny splinter of wood breaks beneath his boot. He looks down. It is a small bronze serpent that was once part of the chest's adornment. Now it is free. It seems to smirk at him. Perhaps it was a subtle joke of fate, or perhaps it is simply a reminder. In the enigmatic world of the Templars, Even broken things become symbols awaiting interpretation. The researcher leaves the chamber. The light outside has changed. Shadows have grown longer and deeper. The abbey outside watches him, indifferent yet all-knowing. Somewhere far beyond these cliffs, other people follow other threads of the same web. The researcher wonders if they, too, laugh at the scholars who still endlessly debate whether the Templars guarded their secrets intentionally or merely stumbled upon them by chance. The serpent-stamped token now feels heavier in his palm, not by weight, but by the profound story it carries. Travelers descend into the depths of the catacombs, located beneath the tranquil, seemingly dormant village of Rennes-le-Château. The air here is not merely cool, it is permeated with antiquity, tangible and dense. It clings to the skin, feels like breath on the neck, and carries a distinct taste of damp limestone, old beeswax, and something metallic. Footsteps echo in strange, uneven rhythms, as if the very bones of history shift to listen intently to the intruders. Stone steps spiral ever downward, like an auger penetrating to the very heart of the earth. Every inch of the walls is covered with intricate carvings. Some images depict saints, their faces softened by centuries of dampness, while others are symbols that do not fit into the canons of any known church. They trace their fingers along a shallow groove, following the lines of an 8-pointed star, cunningly intertwined with a serpent. This is, without a doubt, sacred geometry, but not one that would gain Rome's approval. Overhead, a vaulted ceiling stretches, resembling the ribcage of some sleeping, colossal beast, whose curved bones seem to reliably shelter this secret sanctuary. In the niches, skillfully carved into the walls, rest crumbling statues. Here one can see knights with broken swords and saints whose halos have faded to a barely discernible hint. However, the researcher's attention is drawn to something else. Among the traditional Christian figures are embedded far stranger forms. A woman, as if wrapped in ivy, a man holding a chalice instead of a sword, and a child with a star branded on his chest. Stories once banished from official scripture continue to live here, etched in stone. Some scholars suggest that these catacombs were originally Roman, then repurposed by early Merovingians. Others insist that they predate even pagan times, being druidic chambers that were rebuilt and reused layer by layer, like a palimpsest of forgotten beliefs. However, local legends, those whispered after a few glasses of wine and in too dim light, tell a completely different story. They speak of Templar knights, fleeing the fires of the Inquisition and papal wrath, who did not merely hide treasures of gold and silver. They, according to tradition, buried something far more dangerous. It was a bloodline, living flesh, skillfully hidden beneath a mountain of unbreakable vows and reliably concealed beneath the stony shell of the earth. In one corner, beneath an ancient arch that seems to sag under the weight of centuries, stands a font. However, this is no ordinary holy water font, no gleaming marble adorned with cherubs. Before one's eyes appears a basin carved from black basalt, with a grid of vines and serpents carved upon it, their tails intricately intertwined, forming the shape of an inverted chalice. The persistent scent of myrrh still lingers in the air, sharp and bitter, as if a ritual has just concluded, or perhaps never truly ceased. One can almost vividly imagine hooded figures circling this unusual font, whispering in a language that distorts Latin, transforming it into something far older, far deeper. Clearly, this is not a place of baptism. It is rather a place of anointing, reliable protection, and deep concealment. Suddenly, the observer catches a faint glimmer. A small, slightly displaced stone reveals a hidden cavity. Inside, a scroll is discovered, carefully sealed with wax. Its seal, depicting a red Templar cross pierced by a silver dagger, is an undeniable mark of belonging. The seal has a crack, yet remains unbroken, as if someone in ancient times contemplated opening it, but never dared. The researcher involuntarily freezes in indecision. Unveiling the scroll at this very moment would risk awakening an ancient echo, utterly unintended for the light of day. However, isn't that why one comes here? Isn't curiosity, that most primordial sin, the first legacy bequeathed to humanity by Eve? Some academic minds, safe in their university chairs, tend to argue that the Templar legends associated with Rennes-le-Château are nothing more than fantasies, born from the peculiar eccentricity of a 19th-century priest named Béranger Saunière. They insist that his alleged discovery of mysterious parchments was merely an elaborate ruse, serving as a pretext for ill-gotten gains. But here, beneath the flickering torchlight illuminating ancient carvings, such a theory seems not just erroneous, but frankly insulting. Stones of such profound antiquity have no need for lies. They simply do not require it. One need only recall the chapel from Section 3. Those inscriptions that researchers puzzled over for so long. Those that were perceived more as intricate riddles than as pious psalms. They were not mere decoration. They served as warnings, pointers unmistakably hinting at what lay hidden beneath them. And this font, this basalt chalice, it is by no means an ordinary relic. It is a vessel specifically designed to hold blood, sacred, unconquered blood. Blood that steadfastly refused to be erased from history. Suddenly, the air in the catacombs stirs almost imperceptibly, faint sounds carried to the ear, a barely perceptible rustle, a shifting stone, the sensation of an alien, perhaps otherworldly breath. The researcher freezes, straining to hear in the ensuing silence, feeling the oppressive weight of the ancient underground passages, which seems to emanate from outside, enveloping from all sides. Here, the walls do not merely serve as a repository for the deceased, they seem to listen intently. They guard vigilantly. Or perhaps they patiently await their hour. Ancient traditions whisper of a child, secretly anointed in these depths, not with ordinary water, but with the sanctity of his bloodline, a child whose very existence constituted a heresy, challenging the Vatican's most cherished truths. The question of whether this descendant's blood still pulses in the veins of unsuspecting people remains one that no one dares to utter aloud. However, the observer wonders how many layers of history must be peeled back, and how many secrets revealed before the truth fully unfolds. The torch flame, as if caught by a sudden invisible gust of air, begins to flicker anxiously. This trembling light picks out of the darkness something that had previously escaped the observer's attention. A mosaic, half hidden beneath a layer of debris and centuries of dust. Carefully brushing away the grime, the researcher discovers an image of a knight, gently holding a swaddled infant, enveloped in the shadow of an overhanging cross. However, this is clearly not an image of Christ. The infant's head lacks a halo. Instead, a faint outline of a crown is barely visible. This is not a symbol of salvation, but rather an allegory of concealment, of a deep mystery. Some historians argue that the Knights Templar once guarded priceless relics, perhaps from Solomon's temple itself. Others insist that their true mission was the protection of the Sangreal, but not as a chalice, rather as an embodiment of royal blood, a bloodline transmitted through flesh, not through material artifacts. What if both of these versions contain a grain of truth? What if the real treasure was not gold or a sacred vessel, but a child, born with a name capable of overthrowing kings and popes? The observer pauses, intently examining the mosaic, the scroll, and the font. From above, from the village church, a dull, distant bell rings, as if echoing into this underground world. There, on the surface, life flows on as usual. Market stalls bustle. Confessions are whispered in confessional boxes. Rosaries are fingered in a familiar, monotonous rhythm. Here, deep underground, another confession is kept. One that the church tried to bury beneath centuries of prayers and dogmas, but which the stone and the eternal symbol of the serpent stubbornly refuse to forget. Then footsteps sound, this time utterly distinct and undeniable. The observer realizes he is no longer alone in these depths. Catacombs, it is known, never favored solitary visitors. Perhaps it was the guardian of these ancient mysteries. Perhaps another seeker, like himself. Or, more likely, in such places, the line between guardian and seeker becomes far thinner than one would like to admit. The researcher feels it now, a low, vibrating hum beneath his feet. It is a pulse that has nothing to do with the Earth's core, but everything to do with what has been confined for too long. The Templars, perhaps, vanished from the pages of official history textbooks, yet in these ancient stones, in this silent chamber, their unbreakable testament lives on. And as his fingers carefully touch the cracked wax seal, he realizes a profound truth. Some legacies are not merely unearthed from oblivion. They are awakened to new life. By the time the monk returned, carrying parchment, a sharp quill, and a half-spilled inkwell, the old knight's hands were trembling too much for him to write himself. His fingers, gnarled and stiff, resembled fragile, broken twigs, deformed by years of service and numerous sword scars. Yet his voice remained remarkably firm and clear. It was not the booming, authoritative command of a Templar captain, but rather the deep, almost soundless whisper of a man who, throughout his life, had guarded a truth far more dangerous than any steel blade. Brother Mathieu sat close by, carefully dipping the quill in ink and attentively awaiting each word, like a diligent student before a sacred, hidden text. "Write," the knight exhaled with difficulty, his words filled with ancient wisdom and pain. "Write that all kings invariably fear what they do not possess. The Merovingians, of course, claimed divine blood. But what true power can divine blood possess if it cannot be bought, subdued, or finally buried?" Brother Mathieu's brow involuntarily furrowed in surprise and some disbelief. "You speak of the Grail bloodline," he clarified, trying to grasp the full depth of what was said. The knight slowly nodded in response, confirming his guess. "They did not merely guard it," the old man continued with a deep sigh. "They were it." The true Grail turned out not to be a sacred chalice, as commonly believed, but a womb, a vessel of living flesh. A woman. Her descendants were persecuted and exterminated not for their beliefs or faith, but for what flowed in their veins, for the blood that could one day legitimize a competing throne. or even challenge the existing church, creating a powerful rival. Beyond the building walls, the wind moaned mournfully, sweeping over the ancient stonework, as if nature itself mourned the unbearable burden of history. The fire in the hearth, dying down, became a single, flickering red eye. Brother Mathieu, striving not to miss a word, wrote as quickly as possible, pausing only when the knight's voice faltered or his thoughts involuntarily drifted to images of long-gone faces, people who fell in nameless battles the world never knew about. The church, of course, feared corruption, yes, the knight continued, barely audible. But even more, it feared exposure. Feared that beneath the splendor of gilded mitres and the gleam of holy relics, the truth had long seeped into the very depths of the earth, becoming inaccessible to their power, uncontrollable by their influence. That Mary Magdalene's child still lives among people, walks this earth. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyelids for a moment. His chest, like the receding tide, slowly rose and then fell, completing its course. Sailing from the Holy Land, we brought something far more significant than mere relics, he uttered. Yes, we had parchments, seals, bones, but also something inexpressibly sacred. It was the memory of a bloodline, not a product of myths or poetic fabrications, but living flesh and authentic names. Brother Mathieu's hand froze, not moving across the page. You have these names? He asked. Yes, the knight whispered softly. We have the names and a map that was always in plain sight, right beneath our feet. It is not drawn with lines, but carved into the geometry itself. The true map is the church itself, not its walls, not its layout, not its floor stones, but its axes, its ancient rites, skillfully encoded in the architecture. Mathieu blinked, his mind overwhelmed by what he had heard. You see, Rennes-le-Château was built not only as a sanctuary for the worship of God, but also as a guardian of gates, the knight continued. Beneath it rests a Roman temple, and deeper still, something even more ancient, a chamber sealed with 8 iron bolts, one for each knight entrusted with this sacred secret. The wind outside intensified, howling with renewed force, and somewhere outside, a bell quietly swayed on a rope, emitting a faint chime, though no one touched it. The knight opened one eye. They will come, he said with certainty. Not simple peasants, but others, those who patiently wait in silence. Descendants of those 8 original knights. When they feel the seal weakening, when one of us leaves this world, they will gather again. He suddenly gripped the monk's hand tightly, his eyes burning with resolve. They must under no circumstances fall into the hands of kings, bishops, or Rome. The child must be kept secret, protected, taught to remember without recalling. Taught symbols, not admonitions, stories, not sermons. Only then can we preserve him. The child, Mathieu repeated. The bloodline is still unbroken. The knight leaned even closer, his breath hoarsely brushing the monk's cheek. Yes, and he is closer than you can imagine. Look at the families that have always stood out. At the midwives who suddenly disappear. At the stonemasons who do far more than they are paid. At the women who speak Latin, though they have never left their native village. At the boys who dream of lions and stars, though no one has ever told them these stories. He leaned back again. The sudden surge of strength faded, replaced by deep fatigue, like a retreating tide. Brother Mathieu gazed at the parchment, now densely covered with words and mysterious warnings. He wanted to ask more questions, but the knight closed his eyes, his lips moving silently in prayer. Moments passed. The candle flame sank low, almost extinguishing. Then, from deep beneath the chapel, the knight whispered again, "It is an ossuary of the forgotten. Move the fourth skull from the left. Behind it, a lock. Use the token from my pouch. It will open the gates." Mathieu's quill scratched faster, smearing ink across the parchment. Inside you will find a bronze star. It is not the relic itself, but it is a cipher. Place it upon any of the ancient Templar maps, and the map will open. The Grail was never lost. It was hidden in heritage. The fire in the hearth crackled, creating a cozy atmosphere. The knight smiled faintly, his eyes now clouded, as if veiled. "And one last thing, brother," he said. Mathieu leaned in closer to hear. "They will try to distort this." The knight's voice was barely audible. "The Vatican, the kings, even the Masons. But remember this: truth does not need a cathedral to stand. It only needs memory and a whisper, passed on at the right moment. Now you are that whisper." With these words, his head tilted to the side and the candle went out, plunging the room into semi-darkness. A profound silence fell, broken only by Brother Mathieu's quickened breathing. He gently closed the knight's eyes, then drew the cloak over his face. The bell rang again, though no one was in the belfry, and far beneath the chapel, beyond ancient bones and forgotten stone, a faint metallic click echoed in the darkness, like the turning of a key after centuries of waiting. Spring dawn arrived not with the joyous singing of birds, but with a profound silence that hung in the air, like a held breath, not from fear, but from reverence. Hidden behind the crumbling apse of a derelict priory, beneath tangled ivy and rusted gates that groaned like a dying man with every movement, lay a forgotten garden. Some claimed it once belonged to the abbess of Montségur, a Cathar woman of extraordinary learning, who knew the ancient names of stars and the old names of plants. Others insisted it was planted with earth brought from Jerusalem by weary Templars, who returned not only with relics, but with profound secrets. Father Matarin arrived just as the first morning mist enshrouded the grass like fine silk. He had walked since midnight, guided by a map etched on sheepskin, written not in Latin, but in the secret language of the shroud's companions. A language expressed not in words, but in symbols overlaid on geometry, and geometry veiled in silence. The garden was a perfect square, 24 paces by 24, bounded at the corners by carved stones with faded symbols, a chalice, a sword, a sunbeam, and an 8-pointed star. In the very center bloomed a single rose bush. It was unlike other roses. Its petals were dark crimson, almost black, the color not of passion but of old blood, dried and consecrated. They opened only once a year on the feast of Mary Magdalene, and only for those who bore a special mark. Matarin approached closer, removing his glove. The scar on his palm had long faded, but in the right light, the seal was still visible, a tiny brand in the shape of a double cross within a circle. It had been burned onto him in childhood, during a ritual he barely remembered, only that it involved stone water, an iron chalice, and an oath uttered in 3 languages. Matarin's thoughts froze as his hand hovered over the delicate rose. At that moment, an unearthly wind rose. Not a simple breeze, but an ancient breath, sweeping through the centuries-old yew trees that framed the garden's borders. The petals of the flower began to tremble, and from their hidden folds emerged a soft, golden shimmer. There, concealed within, was a scroll case, elegant, no longer than a human finger, sealed at both ends with red wax. Upon it was the mark of a lion, the crest of the house of Béziers. Mazarin felt an internal hesitation, for the house of Béziers had been wiped from the face of the earth during the brutal Albigensian crusade. Their lands were confiscated, and their children either scattered across the world or ruthlessly killed. However, their bloodline had not vanished without a trace. It had merely gone underground, carefully preserved, guarded, and passed down from generation to generation through women who, lacking titles, carried the truth in their veins. Mazarin decisively broke the wax seal. Inside the scroll case was a tightly rolled strip of old parchment, no wider than a ribbon. Encrypted on it was a code, rendered in sacred geometry, intertwining circles and mirrored lines that, to the untrained eye, seemed no more than meaningless childish scribbles. But to Mazarin, trained from the age of 12 in the sacred arts of Templar cryptography, these symbols resonated like a solemn psalm. This was a place denoted not by names, but by ratios. The divine proportion of phi, encoded in the distances between ancient chapels, sanctuaries, and standing stones scattered throughout southern Gaul. This was a map that could only be seen from above, as a soaring hawk would see it, or a celestial angel would record it. He sat in complete silence, his breathing shallow as the weight of the implications settled upon him like sharp iron nails. The bloodline had not vanished. It had merely dispersed, cleverly hidden in plain sight among ancient tombs by the hearth, among the daughters of forgotten names, and now it called for reunification. He looked at the rose again. A single petal gently fell to the ground, its edges curled like old parchment brought too close to a flame. It was a sign. The time was inexorably approaching. At that very moment, far to the south, in a quiet convent nestled among olive groves and silent hills, a young girl named Isaura stood before a mirror. She was 17, her hair the color of old oak, and her eyes a deep wine hue, dark as ink. Her hands were calloused from hard work, grinding herbs, carrying buckets, tending to the sick. Yet when she pressed them to her heart, she felt something stir beneath her skin, as if an ancient current passed through her blood. Behind her, the abbess silently entered. "You had the dream again," the old woman said, not asking a question. Isaura nodded. "Of the lion and the flame," she whispered. The abbess's eyes narrowed. "You are ready?" she whispered back. With slow, careful movements, the abbess opened a drawer that no one else had ever seen. From it, she took out a pendant, a circle enclosing an 8-pointed star, carved from ivory, darkened by centuries. "It is time to know who you are." Mazarin would meet Isaura only 6 months later. By then, 3 crypts would be opened, 2 bloodlines revealed, and 1 secret would dangerously approach the surface. But for now, the garden remained silent. The rose, having fulfilled its mission of delivering the message, would again close its petals, curling into a mystery, awaiting the next generation or the next danger. And far beneath the garden, deep beneath layers of roots and forgotten stone, lay a chamber, sealed with lime and iron. Inside it were 3 artifacts: a chalice of stone, carved, as legend claimed, by Joseph of Arimathea, a book bound in human skin, whose words were visible only in reflection, and a sword without a blade, but with a name, Veritas. They had waited long, but soon the blood would rise again. The candle in the lantern had long burned down, its wick struggling with the stagnant, crypt-like air. Matarin's breath faintly misted as he knelt before the ancient altar, his fingers tightly gripping the hilt of the sacred sword Veritas. The stone beneath him was cold and damp, covered with barely discernible inscriptions, worn away by centuries of prayers and silence. Here, beneath the monastery's foundation, lay the ultimate truth he had carried across Europe, a truth contained not in scrolls or symbols, but in blood. Behind him, Isaura stood motionless, pressing the ivory pendant close to her heart. Her eyes had long grown accustomed to the dim amber light that now revealed the full width of the chamber. It was not a tomb, as she had initially thought, but a memory, etched in stone. Frescoes danced across the walls, their colors faded with time. But still discernible were images, knights in red robes, riding towards the rising sun, a crowned child, raised by an old man, enveloped in starlight, a chalice nestled in the roots of an olive tree. Matarin's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. These images were painted by Brother Almeric the Silent. He was the last of the Templar artists permitted to depict what truly happened. This, he pointed to the wall with the chalice and child, is not legend. It is a testament. Isaura moved closer, careful not to disturb the patterned dust covering the floor. Her gaze fell upon the figure of the child. Golden curls, a serene face, innocent and divine. "This child," she whispered. "This must be." "Yes," Matarin replied. "The bloodline, born of Christ and Magdalene, protected through the ages by those deemed heretics, and persecuted by those who feared the truth might shatter." Isaura felt the weight of the pendant intensify. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced its 8-pointed edges. "And you believe I am of this lineage?" Matarin looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I no longer believe, I know." He slowly rose, the sword scraping softly against its scabbard, and approached an ancient stone cabinet built into the wall. On its face was the mark of a lion and a cross. With effort, he pressed the hilt of Veritas into a central niche. The sword slid into the stone with a click. Mechanisms groaned, and the cabinet doors creaked open. Inside lay a codex, its pages sealed with red wax in 7 places. Beside it lay a velvet pouch and a silver mirror the size of a palm. Its edges were inscribed with Latin. The quiet heart of blood Matarin, in deep contemplation, murmured about the 7 seals. Each of them, he explained, symbolized a covenant that had been broken by the Church, and only the blood of the ancient lineage could open them, without the need for fire. Isaura, visibly hesitating, reached out. "But I've never even studied Latin," she said, expressing her uncertainty. Matarin, with a gentle smile, replied, "You don't need to. Your hands will remember what your mind cannot hold. Blood carries knowledge that consciousness sometimes forgets." With trepidation, she lifted the ancient codex. At the very moment her fingers touched its cover, a powerful impulse surged through her body. It was not pain, but rather a sensation of scorching heat, as if she stood beneath a radiant stained glass window, bathed in sunlight. She gasped, and before anyone could utter a word, one of the bright red seals cracked with a dry, sharp sound. Matarin knelt again, but this time not in reverence, but with a clear sense of relief. So it is true. You carry it, he whispered. Isara's voice trembled with emotion. What will happen if I open the others? He turned his gaze to the mirror, which now emitted a soft glow in the flickering light. You will remember, he replied. But not as old stories, but as truths personally experienced. These will be visions, transmitted through blood. She hesitated for only a brief moment. Then, slowly, her trembling hands pressed her thumb against the next seal. One by one they broke, each with a characteristic crack. With each seal's rupture, it seemed as if the chamber itself came alive, breathing. The walls exhaled the scent of ancient incense, and the floor hummed with an energy that clearly did not belong to this century. Isara's eyes closed, and floods of images poured into her consciousness. Before her lay a desert beneath boundless stars. A man wept, gently kissing the forehead of a newborn infant beneath the shade of a fig tree. Roman soldiers ruthlessly burned scrolls, while a veiled woman secretly carried one out, wrapped in swaddling clothes. Then a fortress appeared on a hill. Red crosses on white cloaks, whispers of oaths in a language long lost in the depths of time. A besieged monastery, sisters forming a circle around a child whose body glowed with an inner light. She stumbled, and Matarine managed to catch her. Breathe, he said softly. Everything cannot return at once. Tears streamed down her cheeks. It's real. All of it. I saw her. I saw her. You saw Magdalene, Matarine said with reverence. The one who carried the light when the world turned its back on it. For a long time they stood in silence. The crypt held its silence like a shroud, but now it no longer felt cold. The sword Veritas now emitted a faint glow from its hilt. The pendant around Isara's neck pulsed with a steady, confident rhythm. In the end, Isara fully opened the codex. Its parchment pages practically blossomed at her touch. Golden ink caught the lantern's light, revealing genealogical charts, sacred instructions, and prophecies expressed not in words, but in symbolism. I am the bridge, she murmured, her eyes scanning the luminous text, the bearer of both the wound and the balm. Matarine bowed his head. This means your life will not belong solely to you. Many will seek you, some to protect, but many more to silence. Isara looked up, her gaze now different, clearer, more mature. Then I will not hide. I will remember. He smiled, but it was a smile not of joy, but of stern hope. Then I have fulfilled my vow. From his cloak he produced the last item, a wax-sealed letter. On the wax, again, was the lion and the faint outline of the sun. This, he said, handing it to her, must be delivered to one who awaits in Roussillon. He too remembers. Isara nodded. And you? She asked. I remain here. The bloodline must move forward. I belong to the past. She opened her mouth to object, but the piercing look in his eyes silenced her. He had resigned himself to his fate. This crypt, this chamber of truth, would be both his tomb and his temple. The last candle flickered, poised to extinguish. Isara stepped towards the passage, the codex in her hand, the pendant pleasantly warming her chest. The rose had bloomed, and the world would never be the same. The road to Montségur wound along the rocky spine of the Pyrenees, like a serpent ceaselessly guarding its priceless treasure. Winds howled in the cliffs and deep gorges, moaning like the souls of the dead who once perished in the flames at the foot of the ancient fortress. Now, centuries later, the mountains still seemed scorched by memory, its blackened soil refusing to forget those terrible events. Claire's boots slipped on the mossy stones as she ascended the last steps of the ruined keep. Her cloak, damp with the penetrating mist, clung to her shoulders, and her breathing was shallow and ragged. Behind her, Brother Mathieu grunted under the significant weight of a bronze casket he carried. This narrow, weathered box was adorned with an etched Templar cross and flanked by 2 lion effigies. "No one has passed here since the purge," he muttered, his voice strained. "This is a cursed place." Claire stopped and turned to him. "And yet here we are, walking straight into the heart of the curse," she replied. Mathieu grimaced. "Because you believe in prophecy?" he asked doubtfully. "I believe," Claire said firmly and coldly, "that Montségur holds a truth they feared so much, they burned hundreds of souls alive." They passed under the broken arch of the once mighty gate. Ivy and wild rose now entwined the walls where vigilant guards once stood. In the courtyard, the bones of old Cathars had long since scattered, turning to ash and legend, but Claire could almost physically smell the charred faith in the air. She touched the hilt of her dagger, as if to reassure herself that some truths still remained hard and unyielding in the ruined chapel. In the ruined chapel, Mathieu carefully placed the bronze casket on the cracked altar. "This is it," he said. "You saw it in the manuscripts." She nodded. "The Occitan book mentions an archive hidden beneath the chapel floor. Not scrolls, but blood. Not ink, but memory. This is the Sangral Codex." Mathieu's hands trembled as he opened the casket. Inside lay a small knife, an ivory vial sealed with wax, and a parchment with a map of the chapel floor. A red cross clearly marked the altar's foundation. Claire knelt and began clearing debris from the altar's base. Loose stones shifted, revealing a trap door. Its iron ring was rusty but surprisingly intact. She pried it open with the knife. A gust of stale, cold air rose from the darkness hidden below. Without hesitation, she lit a torch and descended into the unknown depths. The path ahead was narrow, as if carved from solid stone by an ancient hand, winding like a passage burrowed by some unknown creature of distant eras. With each step deeper, the air became more piercing, reaching a chilling cold comparable only to frozen, ice-bound memory. Eventually, this winding tunnel led the travelers into a small room, no larger than a humble monk's cell. The stone walls of the room were meticulously decorated with concentric patterns, representing a rich iconography of the Templars, crosses intertwined, shining stars, the monogram of Christ, and the symbol of a dove. In the very center of this sacred space stood a pedestal, carved from dark black stone. Upon its summit rested a chalice. It did not gleam with gold or glitter with precious stones, contrary to the picturesque descriptions of ancient legends. The object proved surprisingly simple, made of clay and covered with a glaze whose color resembled dried blood, congealed around its rim. Next to this chalice was another, smaller casket, tightly sealed with red wax and marked with the symbol of an 8-pointed star. Claire instinctively reached for the mysterious casket, but then paused, as if an invisible force stopped her. It must be opened with blood. Her soft whisper barely registered in the still air. Mathieu, who was now directly behind her, took a hesitant step forward. "This is sheer madness," he said, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Then madness has led us here," Claire replied with unwavering resolve. From the bronze case she extracted a delicate ivory vial and dripped a single crimson drop onto the seal. The wax reacted instantly, emitting a sizzling sound, and the casket silently opened. Ayo. Inside, contrary to expectations of finding an ancient manuscript, lay a stone tablet, upon which was etched an enigmatic ancient code, a startling blend of Proto-Latin with Hebrew and Cathar symbols. Beneath this tablet was a neatly folded linen cloth, yellowed with age. Claire unfolded it with the utmost care. On the cloth, in wine-red ink, was depicted not a simple but a truly extraordinary genealogical tree. The names inscribed upon it faintly shimmered in the flickering torchlight: Jesus of Nazareth, Mary Magdalene, Sarah. The tree branched through the centuries, and each of its nodes was marked not with familiar dates, but with sacred symbols. Mathieu, stunned by what he saw, knelt. "It's real," he whispered. Claire's throat tightened with emotion. The Saint Graal, the living bloodline," she uttered, realizing the full depth of the discovery. Stepping back, she surveyed the entire chamber. "This room is not merely a tomb," she concluded. "It is a sacred refuge, preserving memory." Suddenly, a subtle movement began within the thick walls. Tiny mechanisms clicked softly into place. Gears began to grind gently, almost silently, and the atmosphere in the room noticeably shifted. Behind the pedestal, which had previously seemed immobile, a second, hidden door opened. Beyond it, a long corridor was revealed, its walls lined with stone shelves. On each of these shelves, neatly arranged, stood sealed vessels. Some were skillfully crafted from clay, others from glass darkened by time, and all were marked with the same enigmatic red ink. Some bore ancient Hebrew names, others Latin. And then, on one of the vessels, she saw her own surname, de Courcy. Claire gasped in surprise. "I thought this was all about ancient history, about the past," she whispered. "And so it is," Mathieu said quietly but firmly. "However, the past never truly dies. It merely waits for its time." He stepped forward and carefully opened the nearest vessel. Inside, a single blood-stained feather was found, and a scroll, incredibly fragile, yet miraculously preserved intact. The monk began to read aloud in Latin, his voice echoing down the corridor. Meanwhile, Claire delved deeper into this ancient archive. At the very end of the corridor, the stonework gave way to a unique mosaic, an image of a lion that seemed to devour the sun. Around this central image was a circle of 8 stars, absolutely identical to the symbol on the pendant she constantly wore. Her hand instinctively reached for her chest, and at that very moment, the pendant she wore began to emit a faint yet palpable glow. The chamber, as if a living entity, reacted to this signal. One of the stone shelves silently slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment filled with a soft, warm golden light. Inside, enveloped in this radiance, rested a reliquary, unlike any object she had ever seen before. Crafted from stone, iron, and glass, it had the unusual shape of a flame and pulsed faintly, yet distinctly, as if possessing its own heart. "Alive," Mathieu whispered reverently, crossing himself. "It's not just blood," Claire said, almost inaudibly. "It's the embodiment of memory, life itself." They stood in profound silence, and the air around them seemed to vibrate, filled with ancient, undeniable truth. Outside, over Montségur, storm clouds began to gather again, as if the mountain itself had awakened and remembered the great discovery. Claire shifted her gaze from the reliquary to Mathieu. "This is by no means the end of our journey," she said. "No," he agreed. "This is merely the beginning of theirs." He pointed to the rows of vessels, to the names inscribed upon them, to the sleeping blood of centuries preserved within. Claire closed her eyes, inhaling the mingled scent of stone, dust, and inexorable destiny. Let the world forget, but we will remember. The air filling the secret archive was permeated with cold and stillness, feeling dense with the weighty burden of accumulated memory. The stone walls, adorned with intricate patterns of ancient Templar iconography, seemed to live a hidden life of their own. Each mark left by a chisel appeared as a silent whisper from the deep past. In the far corner of this sacred chamber stood a weathered oak lectern, above which hung an oil lamp. Its wick flickered with an amber light that played and danced over the priceless treasures of the room. Here were vessels of alabaster and bronze, scrolls carefully wrapped in goatskin, and wax-sealed boxes whose age was impossible to determine. Claire stood beside her brother Mathieu, still carefully holding the flame-shaped vessel they had just discovered. Its warm glow had faded slightly, replaced by a faint, quiet pulse, resembling a heartbeat. "This is no ordinary reliquary," Mathieu murmured, his voice reverent. "Its form skillfully mimics the divine flame, the sacred spark of life." Claire, with the utmost care, placed the vessel on the lectern. As soon as it settled into place, a subtle yet distinct click echoed through the archive. A stone slab in the wall silently slid aside, revealing a smaller, hidden compartment. Inside, carefully wrapped in soft velvet and sealed with a wax imprint of an 8-pointed star, lay a scroll unlike any they had seen before. Mathieu, overcome with a mixture of reverence and hesitation, reached for the mysterious scroll. "This seal, the 8-pointed star," he said with a tremble in his voice. "It is the ancient sigil of the original Council of Guardians. It is their sacred testament." Claire, understanding the full significance of the moment, solemnly nodded in response. "Open it," she said softly but firmly. The monk, his fingers moving with exceptional care and reverence, broke the ancient seal. As the scroll slowly unfurled, fine dust rose in the lamplight, as if awakening from a centuries-long sleep. The parchment was undeniably ancient, but the ink, still retaining its deep, dark brown hue, remained strikingly legible. At the very beginning of the scroll, skillfully rendered in Latin, were the words Testamentum Sanguinis Custodes Silenti, which translated to Testament of Blood, Silent Guardians. Mathieu began to translate aloud, his voice clear. "To those who bear the mark and the burden, know. The bloodline is sacred not for earthly power, but solely for preservation. The vessel of divine heritage shall never be used for dominion, but only for eternal remembrance. In the shadow of kings and the pervasive corruption of Rome, we have concealed the truth beneath the mantle of stone and profound silence." A sudden tremor shot through Claire's heart, making it beat faster. "They knew," she whispered barely audibly. "They knew how the church and powerful monarchs would distort the truth." Her gaze swept across the ancient scroll, where a procession of names representing the descendants of the great bloodline stretched through the centuries. Each name was accompanied by a unique sigil, an indication of location, and a special guardian's mark. As she neared the final part of the document, Claire discovered one name that sent a deep chill through her: Clarissa de Bouchard. She was designated as the Keeper of the Flame, Daughter of the Vine, the last heir of Magdalene's lineage. Clarissa, that was her full name, carefully hidden from all records and even from herself. Claire's knees buckled treacherously, and she had to clutch at the massive lectern to steady herself. Mathieu, pale as a sheet, quickly supported her. "They foresaw your lineage many centuries before these current events," he said, with reverence in his voice. "Your birth was never a matter of chance." She stared intently at her name, etched in ancient parchment even before her own birth. "My father," she murmured, as if trying to comprehend what she had heard. "He must have known this. Otherwise, why conceal it all?" Mathieu continued reading, his voice solemn. "At the rising of the lion, when flame and vine merge beneath the tower of the moon, the guardian of the last blood shall awaken the sealed sanctuary. There rests the Grail, which is not a chalice, but a covenant." Thoughts swirled in Claire's mind, trying to grasp the new information. The Grail is not just a chalice, she thought. Mathieu slowly shook his head, confirming her suspicions. Its true purpose was never merely a drinking vessel. The word gradalis itself originally meant a step, a passage, a transformation. Their gazes returned to the enigmatic flame-shaped vessel. What they had previously mistaken for an ordinary container now appeared in a completely different light. Perhaps it was a key, the covenant mentioned in the ancient scroll. It was not a physical object to be possessed or owned. It was rather a rite, a sacred moment of transcendence and deep memory. Suddenly, from a far corner of the room, a faint tremor, shaking centuries of dust. One of the walls began to shimmer, and on its surface the clear outline of an arched doorway appeared, as if etched by light, as if responding to the scroll's magic. Mathieu gasped, his voice trembling with excitement. "Claire, this scroll! It's the last seal!" She instinctively stepped forward. With her every movement, the flame-shaped reliquary began to pulse in unison with her heartbeat, and the sigils carved on the doorway flared brighter. The star, the cross, the chalice, the vine, the lion, each symbol came alive, emitting a mysterious light. "This is the sanctuary," Mathieu breathed, awestruck by the revealed truth. The very place the Templars swore to protect with their lives. Claire's gaze lingered on the last lines of the scroll, where the words were inscribed. To awaken the ancient memory of light, the guardian must freely give what was given to them, unblemished blood, uncorrupted intention. At that moment, the complete picture unfolded before her. The vessel demanded not merely her belonging to a certain bloodline, it appealed to her conscious consent, to her voluntary and sincere connection with this heritage, not for the sake of dominion or power, but solely for deep remembrance and the preservation of truth. She turned to Mathieu, and her question sounded more like an affirmation. "You said it wasn't about power. So what is it truly about?" He gave her a weary but wise smile. "It is about hope, about the invaluable legacy we are bound to preserve. It is about the profound reminder that the divine can be inherently human, and the human, divine." Claire resolutely stepped towards the mysterious arch. As she approached, the ancient symbols flared with even greater brilliance, and the massive stone began to move slowly, not backward, like an ordinary door, but upward, sliding smoothly, like an invisible grill. A sudden gust of warm, dry air rushed into the archive, bringing with it a complex aroma of myrrh, old parchment, and something sweeter, reminiscent of freshly crushed grapes. The sanctuary, hidden behind the opening, was bathed in a soft golden light, a light not artificial, but natural, as if preserved by some unknown ancient alchemy. Inside the sanctuary, across the vaulted ceiling, ancient frescoes came alive, as if in a mysterious dance. They depicted Magdalene, tenderly holding a child, beside a man who was not crucified, but radiated an inner light. Further on, a circle of guardians was visible, clad in solemn white and crimson robes. The image of an olive tree with blood-stained roots and fruits burning with fire captivated the eye. Claire froze at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat at the sight. She felt something awaken deep within her, not new knowledge, but an ancient, profound memory. It seemed to her that she had been here before, or rather, her blood held memories of this place. Behind her, Mathieu stood in reverent silence, struck by the grandeur of the moment. With trembling fingers, Claire lifted the reliquary and, taking a deep breath, stepped into the sanctuary. A low, enveloping hum rolled through the chamber. It was not a voice and not a simple vibration, but something in between, defying precise definition. And at that very moment, as her foot crossed the threshold, the frescoes came alive, not literally, but with movement created by the interplay of light and shadow. They seemed to breathe. The divine and the human intertwined on the ceiling, forming a single whole, and Claire suddenly realized that the Grail had never truly been lost. It had always lived, hidden in the hearts and memories of those who were willing to remember. And now, she was to remember everything. The wind, like an ancient storyteller, whispered its tales, sweeping over Montségur's high ridge and carrying with it the pungent scent of sage and damp old stone. Claire stood on the very edge of the fortress's majestic ruins, her boots seemingly deeply rooted in the soil, steeped in centuries of blood. The sun was just beginning its journey behind the jagged, serrated peaks of the Pyrenees, painting the boundless sky in shades of amber fire and bathing the ancient stones in golden light. In her hand rested the final, crucial fragment, a scroll crafted from thin goatskin, sealed with red wax, upon which an 8-pointed star and the sigil of the powerful Templar order were distinctly visible. Mathieu, silently, like a shadow, approached her. He said not a word, merely placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and in that gesture was more understanding than in any words. No explanations were needed between them anymore. Their journey, full of hardships and discoveries, spoke for itself. They had passed through dark crypts, intricate catacombs, securely sealed tombs, and long-forgotten monasteries. They had bled, hidden from pursuers, fled, solved puzzles, and doubted themselves more than once. But now, finally, after all trials, they stood on the threshold of a great revelation. Claire knelt beside a fractured stone altar that once served as the sacred heart of the Cathars stronghold. Its surface was ravaged by time, eroded by winds, and covered with deep cracks, testifying to bygone eras. However, in the soft light of the setting sun, which gilded everything around, barely discernible carvings began to emerge on its ancient surface, as if coming alive under the rays. Among them, mysterious runic spirals, elegant vine intertwines, and the central, most significant emblem could be discerned, a chalice, nestled within a heraldic fleur-de-lis. This was not merely a symbol of French royal power, as one might initially think, but something far older and deeper, a sigil of a divine bloodline, carefully guarded in deepest secrecy for countless generations. She carefully extracted the ancient scroll and broke the seal. The wax cracked with an unusual resonant sound, like centuries-old bones awakening from a long sleep. Inside, a parchment was discovered, fragile in appearance, yet surprisingly intact. This time, the writings were inscribed not in familiar Latin, but in Occitan, whose letters flowed smoothly and gracefully, and between the lines, glyphs occasionally appeared, like shimmering constellations embedded in the ancient script. "This is not a confession," Claire whispered, translating the words aloud. "It is rather a remembrance, a testament recorded to protect the truth, to uphold an inherent birthright." She looked up. Through the dilapidated walls, slightly hidden behind a pile of fallen stones and wild fennel bushes, the entrance to an ancient reservoir was visible. Claire had already seen it in a dream. It was a dark, circular opening, descending deep into the earth, and its threshold was guarded by a carved symbol, a red cross flanked by two intertwining serpents. Together, they descended. The air underground was cool, damp, and utterly silent, as if the world had plunged into deep shadow. Only the light of their torches illuminated the walls, covered with crude ochre frescoes. The figures depicted resembled Magdalene, carrying infants, crossing seas, standing beneath the glow of stars. These women were veiled not by shame, but by grandeur, grace, and a fierce, perceptive intelligence. Moving further, they finally found it. A stone sarcophagus, devoid of any identifying marks, except for an 8-pointed star skillfully engraved on its lid. It rested on a special pedestal, surrounded by small altars, each bearing a time-worn object. Here lay a bronze mirror, there a white lily carved from bone nearby, a stone chalice darkened by centuries, and finally a wooden box, carefully sealed with lead. Claire stepped forward, and each beat of her heart echoed in her ears like the tolling of a cathedral bell. She didn't need to ask permission. She placed her hand on the lid, and it felt surprisingly warm. Instead of a prayer, she uttered a declaration, equal in power to sincere faith and fierce determination. "I am not here to worship the past. I am here to remember the truth." And then she lifted the lid. Inside, there was no corpse, no bones, only cloth, folded with reverence, linen white as untouched snow. Upon it rested a single crimson ribbon, worn and fragile at the edges. It was a symbol of blood, not lost in the stream of time, but carried quietly, patiently through the veins of women and men who, perhaps, never even knew their true heritage, but lived it in their acts of compassion, resilience, and light. Mathieu, barely breathing, knelt beside the altar. "This is not the end," he said. "No," Claire whispered. "This is the return." The ribbon trembled, as if touched by an invisible breath. The torchlight flickered. Then something changed. Behind the pedestal, a section of the wall began to glow faintly. A fresco was embedded in the stone, long hidden beneath centuries of dust and mineral deposits. As the torchlight fell upon it, the image slowly but surely revealed itself. A woman holding a child, surrounded by stars. On the child's palm was a mark, a chalice. But beneath them stood not men of war, but women in cloaks, their faces serene and full of strength. At their feet lay a red cross, fractured but still whole. Claire's knees buckled. She sank to the cold stone, tears stinging her eyes. "They never guarded a relic," she said, realization dawning upon her. "They guarded a memory, a truth they feared would be erased. And so they buried it in symbols, in stories, in bloodlines." Mathieu helped her up, So, what now? We share this, she replied, but not with the whole world. Not yet. We share it with those who have already begun to remember, with those who never forgot the taste of light. Together, they ascended back towards the fading daylight. Above the earth, the sky turned a deep violet. A hawk circled overhead, and as the last rays of sun touched the ruins of Montségur, Claire saw it. Not with her eyes, but with something older, the outline of the original fortress, reconstructed in golden light. A vision, or perhaps a memory of stone, and beyond it, a road, unmarked on any map, but ancient, waiting. She turned to Mathieu. Are you ready to follow it? He smiled. I have walked it all my life. As the stars twinkled in the sky, they walked hand in hand along the path, not to an end, but to a deeper beginning, to a place where blood and light meet, where truth waits not in vaults, but in hearts, where the past finally remembers itself